The call came through at 4:17 a.m. on a Thursday morning in late October, when the desert was still wrapped in that particular kind of darkness that makes even familiar roads feel foreign. I'd been with the Navajo Tribal Police for 9 years at that point, working out of the Tuba City Station, and I'd learned to trust my instincts about which calls mattered and which ones would turn out to be nothing. This one, though, had dispatcher Rhea Yazzi's voice carrying a weight I couldn't ignore, a tension that suggested she knew something I didn't yet. She told me a rancher named Thomas Benally had called in about an abandoned vehicle he'd spotted while checking his fence lines after the storm that had torn through the area the night before, leaving the roads slick with mud and the air heavy with that metallic smell that follows lightning strikes across open desert. The storm had been one of those rare autumn tempests that seemed to come out of nowhere, the kind that reminded you the desert wasn't as empty or predictable as it appeared in daylight. I'd spent most of the previous evening at the station, watching through the windows as rain hammered the parking lot and lightning illuminated the distant mesas in brief, violent flashes that made the landscape look like something from another world entirely. By the time I'd driven home around midnight, the worst had passed, leaving only a steady drizzle and roads that had transformed into rivers of red mud. Now, just a few hours later, I was heading back out into the aftermath. My patrol vehicle's headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness as I made my way toward the coordinates Rhea had given me, a stretch of back road about 15 miles northeast of town where the pavement gave way to dirt, and the landscape opened up into vast expanses of scrubland punctuated by sandstone formations that looked like sleeping giants. Thomas Benally was waiting for me where the main road intersected with a smaller track that led toward his grazing lands, his truck idling with the headlights on, illuminating what looked like tire tracks leading off into the desert. He was a man in his 70s who'd lived on this land his entire life, the kind of person who knew every rock and wash for miles around. And when I pulled up beside him and rolled down my window, I could see the concern etched into his weathered face. He didn't waste time with pleasantries, just gestured toward the tracks and told me he'd been following the fence line when he'd seen vultures circling about a quarter-mile out, which was unusual enough at this hour to make him investigate. What he'd found was a silver sedan, a newer model that had no business being out here, stuck nose first in a wash that had probably been dry yesterday but was now filled with several inches of muddy water from the storm runoff. The vehicle was empty, doors closed, windows intact, but something about it had bothered him enough to call it in rather than just assuming someone had gotten stuck and walked out for help. I thanked Thomas and told him he could head home, that I'd handle it from here, but he shook his head and said he'd wait on the main road in case I needed anything. That kind of offer wasn't unusual out here, where help could be hours away and cell service was more myth than reality. But it also told me he was genuinely worried about what I might find. I grabbed my flashlight, radio, and gear bag, then started following the tire tracks on foot, my boots squelching in the mud as I made my way across terrain that would be treacherous even in good conditions. The tracks were deep, suggesting the vehicle had been moving fast when it left the road, and they led in a relatively straight line toward the wash, as if the driver had been running from something or towards something with single-minded determination. As I got closer, I could make out the sedan more clearly in the growing light of dawn, a silver Honda Accord that looked maybe 3 or 4 years old, its front end angled down into the wash and its rear wheels still on slightly higher ground, doors closed and windows fogged from the inside, despite the vehicle being empty. The first thing I noticed when I reached the car was that the driver's side door was unlocked, which immediately struck me as odd because most people instinctively lock their doors, especially if they're abandoning a vehicle in the middle of nowhere. I pulled it open carefully, my flashlight beam sweeping across an interior that was neat and clean except for a child's drawing that had fallen onto the passenger seat. A crayon picture of what looked like a family standing in front of a house, the kind of thing any parent might have their kids' artwork scattered around their car. The keys were still in the ignition, turned to the off position, and the gas gauge showed a quarter tank, more than enough to have made it back to town if the driver had wanted to. The glove compartment held the usual items: registration, insurance papers, owner's manual. But when I pulled out the registration to check the name, something cold settled in my stomach because I recognized it immediately, a name I hadn't thought about in years, but that had never quite left the back of my mind. Jonas Curley. The vehicle was registered to Jonas Curley, a man who had disappeared 6 years ago along with his wife and young daughter, under circumstances that had baffled everyone who'd worked the case. I'd been relatively new to the force back then, not assigned to the investigation but aware of it the way everyone on the reservation had been aware of it, because missing persons cases involving entire families were rare enough to generate the kind of attention that lingered long after the official search had been called off. The Curleys had lived in Tuba City, where Jonas worked as a maintenance supervisor at the high school, and his wife Sarah taught second grade at the elementary school. Their daughter Emma had been 4 years old when they'd vanished, and the last confirmed sighting had been at a gas station in Flagstaff where Jonas had filled up the tank and bought snacks for the drive home. They'd never arrived, and despite extensive searches of the route between Flagstaff and Tuba City, no trace of them or their vehicle, a blue Ford Explorer, had ever been found. Standing there in the mud beside this silver Honda registered to a dead man, or at least a missing man who'd been declared legally dead 3 years after his disappearance, I felt the familiar weight of questions that had no easy answers settling onto my shoulders. The registration showed the Honda had been purchased 2 years ago, which meant someone had bought a car using Jonas Curley's identity long after he'd disappeared. Or Jonas Curley had never actually disappeared at all. I keyed my radio and called it in to Rhea, giving her the vehicle information and the name on the registration, hearing her sharp intake of breath when I mentioned Curley because she'd been working dispatch back then too and remembered the case as clearly as I did. She told me she'd pull the original files and run the vehicle identification number through the system to see what came up, and that she was sending backup to my location. Though, it would take at least 20 minutes for the nearest unit to arrive given how far out I was from anything resembling civilization. While I waited, I conducted a more thorough search of the vehicle's interior, photographing everything with my phone despite the weak signal, and documenting the scene as carefully as I'd been trained to do. The child's drawing on the passenger seat showed 3 stick figures, 2 tall ones and 1 small one, standing in front of a rectangular house with a triangle roof and a circular sun in the corner, the kind of picture any 4-year-old might draw. But when I turned it over, I found writing on the back in what looked like an adult's handwriting. Neat block letters that spelled out 3 words that made my skin crawl in a way I couldn't quite articulate. "Find us, please." The message was brief and desperate, the kind of thing someone might write if they knew they were running out of time. And the paper itself was worn and faded, as if it had been in the car for years rather than days. The back seat held more surprises: a child's booster seat that looked like it had been recently used, judging by the crumbs and small toys scattered around it, and a manila folder wedged between the seat and the door that contained photocopies of old police reports. I pulled the folder out carefully, my hands leaving mud stains on the manila surface, and flipped it open to find copies of reports from the original Curley disappearance investigation, incident reports, witness statements, search logs, everything you'd expect to find in an active case file, but nothing that should have been in the possession of a civilian. Someone had been studying the case, going over the details with enough interest to make copies of official documents, and that someone had been driving this car registered to Jonas Curley when they'd ended up stuck in this wash. The implications were troubling because it suggested either someone was obsessed with the Curley case to the point of identity theft and document forgery, or something far stranger was happening that I didn't yet have the framework to understand. My radio crackled to life with Rhea's voice, tight with tension as she relayed information that only deepened the mystery surrounding this abandoned vehicle and its connection to a 6-year-old cold case. The VIN check had come back with results that contradicted the registration I'd found, showing the Honda had been purchased 3 months ago at a dealership in Phoenix by someone named Marcus Whitehorse, paid for in cash and registered under that name, with no connection to Jonas Curley anywhere in the system. When Rhea had called the dealership, they'd confirmed selling the vehicle to a man matching that description, but had no record of any issues or concerns with the transaction, just a standard cash sale with proper documentation. The fact that the car had Jonas Curley's registration in the glove compartment, but was actually owned by someone else, suggested the registration was either fake or had been deliberately placed there. And neither option made me feel any better about what I'd stumbled into. I moved around to the trunk, half expecting it to be locked, but finding it unlatched when I tested the release button, and when I lifted it open, the smell hit me immediately. Not the overwhelming stench of decay, but something subtler and more disturbing. A musty odor mixed with chemicals I couldn't quite identify. The trunk contained a sleeping bag that looked like it had been used recently, a plastic storage bin filled with canned goods and bottled water, the kind of supplies someone might pack if they were planning to spend time away from civilization, and beneath those items, wrapped in a plastic garbage bag, a set of children's clothing that made my throat tighten because they looked like they'd fit a 4-year-old girl. The clothes were worn and faded, as if they'd been through multiple washings or stored for years, and among them was a small stuffed rabbit with one ear missing and button eyes that seemed to stare up at me from the depths of the trunk with an accusation I couldn't quite name. The sound of an approaching vehicle made me close the trunk and turn towards the main road, where I could see headlights bouncing across the uneven terrain as my backup arrived. Officer Patricia Littlecrow pulled up beside the Honda, and I filled her in on what I'd found while she documented the scene with her own camera and notes, both of us working with the practiced efficiency that came from years of processing crime scenes and accident sites. Patricia had been with the department longer than I had, nearly 15 years, and she'd actually worked on the original Curley investigation back when it was still active, spending weeks following up leads that went nowhere and interviewing people who'd seen nothing useful. When I showed her the registration and told her about the VIN discrepancy, her expression shifted from professional curiosity to something darker, a recognition that we were dealing with something that went beyond a simple abandoned vehicle, or even a case of identity theft. We decided to call for a tow truck and have the Honda impounded for a more thorough forensic examination, because whatever was happening here required resources and expertise beyond what the two of us could provide in the field. While we waited for the tow truck to make its way out from town, Patricia and I searched the immediate area around the wash, looking for any signs of where the driver might have gone after abandoning the vehicle. What we found only added to the strangeness of the situation, because the muddy ground around the car showed footprints leading away from the driver's side door, heading not back toward the main road where help would be, but deeper into the desert toward a cluster of sandstone formations about half a mile distant. The prints were from boots, probably men's size 10 or 11 based on the impressions they left, and they moved in a straight line with purpose rather than the wandering pattern you'd expect from someone who was lost or disoriented. We followed the tracks as far as we could before they disappeared into harder ground near the base of the sandstone formations, calling out occasionally in case the driver was injured or stranded somewhere nearby, but receiving no response except the wind whistling through the rocks and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. The formations created a maze of narrow passages and hidden alcoves, the kind of place where someone could easily hide or get lost, and as Patricia and I stood at the entrance to this natural labyrinth, I felt a profound unease that had nothing to do with the physical dangers of the terrain. Something about the way the footprints had led here with such determination, as if the driver had known exactly where they were going despite the darkness and the storm, suggested this wasn't a random abandonment but part of something planned. though what that plan might be remained frustratingly unclear. My radio crackled again, Ria's voice cutting through the desert silence with information that shifted my understanding of the entire situation in ways I was still processing even as she spoke. She'd pulled the original Curly case file and found something that the investigators at the time had noted, but never been able to explain or follow up on. Witness reports from the weeks before the family's disappearance mentioning that Jonas Curly had seemed distracted and worried, telling co-workers he was concerned about something he'd found while doing maintenance work at the school. One witness, a teacher who'd worked closely with Sarah Curly, remembered Jonas mentioning old files he'd discovered in a storage room, documents from decades earlier that he thought might be important, but that he'd been told to leave alone by the school administration. The witness hadn't known what was in the files, and Jonas had apparently dropped the subject after that conversation, but the timing, just 2 weeks before the family vanished, suggested a possible connection that the original investigators had noted but been unable to pursue when the trail went cold. Standing there in the growing daylight, with the abandoned Honda behind us, and mysterious footprints leading into the sandstone maze ahead, I felt the weight of 6 years of unanswered questions pressing down on me alongside the new mysteries this discovery had created. If Jonas Curly had found something worth disappearing over, or worth being disappeared for, then the appearance of his car 6 years later suggested either he'd been alive all this time and was now reaching out for help, or someone else knew about whatever he'd discovered and was trying to send a message by using his identity. The child's drawing with its desperate plea to find us, and the carefully preserved children's clothing in the trunk painted a picture of a family that might still be out there somewhere, hiding or imprisoned, waiting for someone to piece together the clues they'd left behind. Patricia and I made the decision to request a full search and rescue team, because if there was even a chance that someone from the Curly family was alive and in the area, we needed to find them before the desert claimed another victim. As we walked back to our vehicles to coordinate the response, my radio, which had been quiet except for Ria's transmissions, suddenly erupted with static so loud and harsh that I had to pull the handset away from my ear. The static lasted maybe 5 seconds, overwhelming and almost painful in its intensity, and then it cut off as abruptly as it had started, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. I checked the radio, thinking maybe I'd accidentally triggered some interference, or that there was equipment malfunction, but everything seemed normal. All the right lights showing, the channel clear and ready for transmission. Then it happened again, that same burst of overwhelming static, except this time buried somewhere in the noise I thought I heard something else. A voice maybe, or something that could have been a voice if you wanted to believe it was. Patricia heard it too. I could tell by the way she'd stopped walking and turned to look at her own radio with an expression that mirrored what I was feeling. That mix of professional skepticism and instinctive unease that came from encountering something that didn't fit the normal categories of experience. We stood there in the mud in the early morning light, 2 trained law enforcement officers trying to convince ourselves that what we'd heard was just radio interference or atmospheric conditions creating phantom sounds, but neither of us quite believing it because the sound had been too deliberate. Too much like someone trying to speak through impossible distance or interference to be dismissed as random noise. The tow truck arrived 20 minutes later, and we supervised the extraction of the Honda from the wash, watching as the driver winched it up onto the flatbed with practiced efficiency. As the car was being secured for transport, I took one last look inside, making sure we hadn't missed anything in our initial search, and that's when I noticed something I'd overlooked before in the compartment between the front seats. A small notebook, the kind you could buy at any convenience store, its pages warped from moisture but still mostly legible. I bagged it as evidence and flipped through it carefully, finding pages filled with handwritten notes and sketches, dates and times and locations scattered throughout with no obvious organizing principle that I could determine at first glance. But one entry, dated 3 days ago, caught my attention because it mentioned Tuba City specifically and included coordinates that, when I checked them on my phone, corresponded almost exactly to where we were standing. The note next to the coordinates read simply, "This is where it has to end. They'll find the car and maybe they'll understand. Tell Emma I'm sorry I couldn't protect her better. Tell Sarah I tried to keep my promise. If you're reading this, Officer Begay, you need to look at the files. The real ones, not the copies they gave you. The answer is in what they didn't want Jonas to find." The fact that the note addressed me by name, when I'd never been publicly associated with the Curley case and had only arrived at this scene by random assignment this morning, sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the desert morning air. I showed the notebook to Patricia, watching her face as she read the entry that mentioned my name, seeing her own confusion and concern mirrored in her expression. We'd both been trained to look for rational explanations, to assume that coincidences were just coincidences and that patterns emerged from chaos without requiring sinister explanations, but this felt different in ways that challenged those comfortable assumptions. Someone had known I would be the one to find this car, or at least had hoped I would be. And they'd left a message specifically for me that referenced files I didn't know existed, and made promises about truth and understanding that felt more like threats than reassurances. The search and rescue team would arrive within the hour, bringing dogs and equipment to comb through the sandstone formations. But I had a growing suspicion that whatever we were searching for wouldn't be found by conventional methods, because nothing about this case had been conventional from the moment I'd seen Jonas Curley's name on that registration. As the tow truck pulled away with the Honda secured to its flatbed, heading back toward town and the impound lot where forensic specialists would spend days going over every inch of the vehicle looking for answers, I stayed at the scene with Patricia, waiting for the search team and trying to make sense of the evidence we'd collected. The sun had fully risen now, burning away the last of the morning coolness and painting the desert in shades of red and gold that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. But all I could think about was that child's drawing with its desperate plea, those small clothes in the trunk, that notebook entry that knew my name and promised answers if only I looked in the right places. Somewhere in this vast landscape of rock and sand and silence, there were secrets buried deep enough that they'd cost a family their lives or their freedom, and I'd just been handed the key to finding them, whether I wanted it or not. My radio crackled one more time, just a brief burst of static that could have been atmospheric interference or equipment malfunction, or a dozen other rational explanations. But in that moment, standing in the desert with the morning sun at my back and mystery spreading out before me like the shadows cast by the sandstone formations, I could have sworn I heard my name whispered through the static, clear and distinct and impossible to explain away. Lennox. Just that, my first name spoken in a voice I didn't recognize, but that carried a weight of urgency and desperation that made my hand tighten on the radio handset. Patricia looked at me, asking if I'd heard it too, and when I nodded she made the sign of the cross, a gesture I hadn't seen her make in all the years I'd known her, and whispered something in Navajo that I didn't quite catch, but that sounded like a prayer or a ward against evil. The search team arrived in a convoy of vehicles, bringing dogs and thermal imaging equipment and all the resources we'd requested for what was now being treated as a potential rescue operation with possible criminal elements. I briefed the team leader on what we'd found, showing him the footprints leading toward the sandstone formations and explaining the connection to the Curley cold case, though I left out the part about hearing my name on the radio because that felt like something I needed to process privately before sharing it with people who'd think I was losing my grip on reality. The dogs were released to follow the trail, baying eagerly as they picked up the scent and headed toward the rocks with their handlers following close behind. And Patricia and I joined the search despite having been up since before dawn, because whatever answers were waiting in those formations felt like they were meant for us to find. The dogs led us into the sandstone formations with a confidence that should have been reassuring, but instead only heightened my sense that we were walking into something we didn't fully understand. The handlers, both experienced search and rescue specialists from the Coconino County Sheriff's Department, who'd worked dozens of cases across the region, kept their animals on long leads as we navigated the narrow passages between towering walls of red rock that seemed to absorb sound and light in ways that made normal conversation feel like shouting. Officer Patricia Littlecrow stayed close to me, her hand resting on her sidearm in a way that suggested she felt the same unease I did, that sense of being watched or followed that had nothing to do with any visible threat but everything to do with the weight of 6 years of unanswered questions pressing down on us from all directions. The formations created a maze of corridors and dead ends, some passages so narrow we had to turn sideways to squeeze through, while others opened into bowl-shaped amphitheaters large enough to hold 50 people, their walls streaked with desert varnish and ancient petroglyphs that predated European contact by centuries. One of the handlers, a man named Robert Nez, who'd grown up on the reservation and knew these lands as well as anyone, pointed out markings on the rocks that he said weren't traditional Navajo but might have been left by earlier peoples, ancestral Puebloans or even older cultures whose names had been lost to time. The fact that this area held layers of human history stretching back thousands of years made our search feel simultaneously more urgent and more futile, because if someone wanted to hide here, they could disappear into crevices and alcoves that hadn't been explored in generations, becoming just another mystery in a landscape full of them. About half a mile into the formations, the dogs suddenly became agitated, pulling hard on their leads and barking with an intensity that made their handlers exchange concerned glances. We'd reached what looked like a box canyon, a circular depression surrounded by high walls with only one way in or out, and the dogs were focused on something at the far end where a rockfall had created a jumble of boulders that looked recent, probably dislodged by the storm the previous night. Robert called his dog back and approached the rockfall carefully, testing each boulder before putting his weight on it, while the rest of us spread out to search the perimeter of the canyon for any signs of recent human presence. What I found made me call the others over immediately because pressed into a patch of mud near the canyon wall were boot prints that matched the ones we'd followed from the Honda, along with what looked like drag marks suggesting someone had been pulling or carrying something heavy. Patricia photographed the prints while I examined the rockfall more closely, noticing that some of the boulders showed scrape marks that looked too deliberate to be natural, as if they'd been moved or positioned intentionally. Behind the largest boulder, partially hidden in shadow, I found an opening, not quite a cave but a narrow fissure in the rock face that extended back into darkness beyond where my flashlight could reach. The air coming from the opening carried that same musty chemical smell I'd noticed in the Honda's trunk, along with something else that made my stomach turn. The faint but unmistakable odor of human waste and unwashed bodies. The smell of people who'd been confined in a small space without proper sanitation for an extended period. I called for backup to secure the area and requested additional lighting equipment, because whatever was in that fissure, we needed to approach it with caution and proper documentation. While we waited for the equipment to arrive, I had one of the search team members stay at the entrance to the canyon, while the rest of us maintained a perimeter around the rockfall. Standard procedure for what had now become a potential crime scene rather than just a search and rescue operation. My radio was clipped to my shoulder, volume turned up high enough that I'd hear any transmission clearly, and in the relative quiet of the canyon with only the wind and occasional bird call for background noise, I found myself listening more intently than usual, half expecting another burst of static or whispered name that would confirm I hadn't imagined what I'd heard earlier. Patricia caught me staring at the radio and asked quietly if I was okay, if maybe I needed to take a break and let someone else handle the entry into the fissure when the equipment arrived. But I shook my head because whatever was waiting in that darkness felt like it was connected to me in ways I couldn't explain and didn't want to examine too closely. The lighting equipment arrived 40 minutes later, carried in by fresh officers who'd hiked out from the main road with portable generators and high-intensity lamps that we set up facing the fissure entrance. In the harsh artificial light, the opening looked less ominous and more mundane, just a crack in the rock that had probably been there for thousands of years, widened by erosion and freeze-thaw cycles until it was large enough for a person to squeeze through. But the smell that wafted out when we moved the boulders aside was anything but mundane. A concentrated version of what I'd detected earlier, mixed with something sweet and rotten that made me pull my shirt up over my nose and mouth. Robert Nez, who'd seen and smelled plenty of death in his years doing search and rescue, made a face that suggested he recognized the odor, and when Patricia asked him what he thought, he just said we needed to be prepared for what we might find inside. I volunteered to go in first, partly because it was my investigation, and partly because that notebook entry had addressed me by name, making this feel personal in ways that went beyond professional duty. Patricia insisted on coming with me, and after a brief discussion about the wisdom of sending 2 officers into an unknown space versus having backup remain outside, we compromised by having Robert accompany us while the other search team members maintained positions at the entrance with weapons drawn and radios ready. We squeezed through the fissure one at a time, our flashlights cutting through darkness that seemed to swallow the beams before they could illuminate anything useful, and for the first 20 feet or so the passage was so narrow that my shoulders brushed both walls and I had to focus on controlling my breathing to keep the claustrophobia at bay. Then the passage opened into a chamber, not huge, but large enough that all 3 of us could stand upright with room to move around, and what we found there would haunt my dreams for years to come. The chamber had been converted into a living space, or perhaps more accurately, a survival space, with sleeping bags laid out on the floor, plastic storage containers stacked against one wall holding supplies, and a makeshift latrine area in the far corner that explained the smell. But it was the walls that captured my attention, because every available surface had been covered with writing and drawings, some in pen or marker, and others scratched directly into the soft sandstone. A desperate chronicle of time spent in captivity or hiding that stretched across weeks or months or possibly even years. The handwriting varied, suggesting multiple people had contributed to this bizarre mural, and among the scrawled messages I recognized the same neat block letters from the notebook we'd found in the Honda. Patricia was photographing everything systematically, her camera flash creating brief moments of harsh illumination that made the chamber feel even more oppressive, while Robert examined the supplies and sleeping bags to determine how recently they'd been used. I focused on the writing, trying to parse meaning from what appeared at first glance to be a random collection of dates, names, and cryptic messages that referenced events and people I didn't recognize. But patterns began to emerge as I studied the walls more carefully, particularly a section near the entrance where someone had created a timeline stretching from 6 years ago to just 3 days prior, marking significant events with dates and brief descriptions that told a story of fear and desperation and survival against impossible odds. The timeline began with an entry dated to the day the Curley family had disappeared, marked simply with Day 1 they found us, followed by coordinates that I recognized as being near the Arizona-Utah border, about 80 miles north of where we were currently standing. Subsequent entries tracked what appeared to be a journey, sometimes covering only a few miles per day and other times making longer jumps, always moving but never staying in one place long enough to establish any kind of permanent settlement. The entries for the first year were frequent, almost daily, but they became less regular after that, sometimes going weeks between updates as if whoever was maintaining the timeline had either given up the effort or been prevented from continuing it. But the final entry, dated 3 days ago, was written in that same neat handwriting from the notebook. Lennox Begay will understand. He has to understand. We left everything he needs to find the truth. Robert called us over to where he'd been examining the supplies, his voice tight with a tension that suggested he'd found something significant. The plastic storage containers held mostly non-perishable food items, canned goods, and dried fruit and energy bars, the kind of supplies you could accumulate slowly from gas stations and convenience stores without arousing suspicion. But one container held something different entirely, a collection of documents and photographs that Robert had carefully laid out on the floor in neat rows for us to examine. The photographs showed people I didn't recognize at first, men and women in what appeared to be official settings, government offices or conference rooms, engaged in conversations or reviewing documents. But when Patricia leaned in closer and pointed out faces she recognized, my blood ran cold, because several of the people in these photographs were tribal officials, members of councils and committees that oversaw resource management and development projects on the reservation. The documents were harder to parse, dense technical language about mineral rights and water access and land use permits, the kind of bureaucratic paperwork that made my eyes glaze over under normal circumstances. But Robert, who'd worked in environmental protection before joining search and rescue, started pointing out inconsistencies and irregularities that suggested these weren't just routine administrative documents, but evidence of something corrupt. Permits approved without proper review. Resources allocated to shell companies with no legitimate business presence. Money changing hands in ways that benefited specific individuals while leaving communities vulnerable to exploitation and harm. Jonas Curley had been a maintenance supervisor at a high school, not an environmental lawyer or forensic accountant, but somehow he'd pieced together enough of this puzzle to recognize what was happening, and that recognition had made him and his family targets. I was about to radio back to the officers at the entrance when I noticed something else on the chamber floor, partially hidden beneath one of the sleeping bags. It was a child's shoe, small and pink with cartoon characters on the side, the kind that would fit a 4-year-old girl. I picked it up carefully, my throat tight with an emotion I couldn't quite name, because this single piece of physical evidence confirmed what the timeline and the writing on the walls had suggested, but what I'd been trying not to fully accept. Emma Curley, or someone her age and size, had been in this chamber, living in this darkness with whoever had been maintaining that desperate chronicle on the walls. The shoe was worn but not falling apart, suggesting it had been used regularly rather than just stored away, and when I turned it over, I found writing on the sole in black marker, Emma C., age 4, followed by a date that matched the day the family had disappeared. Patricia saw my expression and came over to look at what I'd found, her own face going pale as she realized the implications. We'd been searching for evidence of what had happened to the Curley family, expecting to find either bodies or nothing at all. But instead, we'd stumbled into something more complex and more disturbing than a simple murder or disappearance. The family had been alive, at least for some period after they'd vanished, living in hiding and moving from place to place while documenting evidence of corruption that they'd hoped someone would eventually find and understand. But the fact that the chamber was currently empty, with no signs of anyone having been here in the last few days based on Robert's assessment of the supplies and sleeping bags, raised the question of where they were now and whether they were still alive to answer the questions their evidence had created. My radio crackled, and I tensed reflexively, expecting static or whispered words, but it was just one of the officers at the entrance asking for a status update. I gave him a brief summary of what we'd found, requesting that he contact the FBI field office in Flagstaff because this had escalated beyond the scope of what tribal police could handle alone, touching on federal corruption and possibly crossing state lines multiple times over the course of years. As I was finishing the transmission, I noticed something carved into the wall above where the timeline ended. Letters scratched deep into the sandstone with enough force to leave grooves I could fit my fingertip into. The files are in the school, storage room 3B. They tried to burn them, but Jonas saved them. Tell Sarah I love her. "Tell Emma Daddy is sorry." The message felt like a suicide note or a last testament, the kind of thing someone would write if they believed they wouldn't survive to deliver the information personally, and the reference to Jonas in the third person suggested it had been written by someone else, possibly Sarah Curley trying to preserve her husband's discovery even as their situation became increasingly desperate. But the message also provided concrete direction, a specific location where we might find the original files that Jonas had discovered and that had set this entire tragedy in motion. I made a note of the storage room number and radioed back to the station, asking Ria Yazzie to contact the high school administration and arrange for us to access their storage facilities as soon as we finished processing this scene. We spent another hour documenting everything in the chamber, photographing every inch of the walls and cataloging every item among the supplies, building a comprehensive record of what had clearly been a long-term survival situation that had only recently been abandoned. The sleeping bags were rated for cold weather, suggesting whoever had been using them had planned for or experienced winter conditions in this chamber, and the food supplies included items that would require cooking, with a small camping stove tucked in one corner, along with fuel canisters that were mostly empty. It painted a picture of determined survival, people who'd adapted to circumstances that would have broken most individuals, finding ways to stay alive and hidden, while maintaining their mission to expose the corruption they'd uncovered. As we were preparing to leave the chamber, Robert discovered one more item of significance tucked behind the stack of storage containers. A smartphone that looked several years old with a cracked screen and a dead battery. Standard procedure would have been to bag it as evidence and send it to the crime lab for analysis. But something made me ask Robert if he had a charging cable in his pack, and when he produced one that fit the phone's port, I used the portable battery I carried for emergencies to bring the device back to life. The phone took several minutes to boot up, its logo appearing and disappearing multiple times before finally loading to a lock screen that showed a photograph of the Curley family, Jonas and Sarah and young Emma, all smiling at the camera in what looked like a happier time, before whatever they'd discovered had turned their lives into a nightmare of hiding and fear. Patricia suggested we wait to attempt accessing the phone until we had proper forensic support, but I had a feeling that whatever was on this device was meant to be found and used immediately, not locked away in an evidence locker while we waited for the bureaucratic machinery of justice to grind forward. I tried the most common unlock patterns and passcodes, getting nowhere until I thought about the message carved into the wall and tried a code based on the storage room number, 3B, which translated to 32 on a numeric keypad. The phone unlocked immediately, revealing a home screen with only a few apps installed. No games or social media or any of the usual distractions. Just basic communication tools and a notes app that showed 47 entries when I opened it. The entries were dated, like the timeline on the wall but with much more detail. A day-by-day account of the Curley family's life on the run that began with their initial discovery of the corruption Jonas had uncovered, and traced their desperate attempts to find someone they could trust with the information. The early entries spoke of going to local authorities only to find that some of the people they'd approached were themselves involved in the schemes Jonas had documented, and of realizing they were being followed and watched, their phones tapped and their movements tracked by people with resources that far exceeded what they'd expected. The decision to run had come after someone broke into their home while they were away, not stealing anything but leaving a clear message by rearranging Emma's toys into a pattern that could only have been deliberate, a warning that even their daughter wasn't safe if they continued asking questions. I scrolled through the entries, watching the family's situation deteriorate from month to month and year to year, as they exhausted their savings and lost contact with friends and family who thought they'd simply abandoned their lives for unknown reasons. There were entries about Emma's birthdays celebrated in hiding, about Sarah's struggles to continue her daughter's education without access to schools or proper materials, about Jonas's deteriorating health from stress and inadequate medical care as they moved from temporary shelter to temporary shelter. But there were also entries about small victories, documents successfully hidden or copied, evidence gathered and stashed in multiple locations against the possibility that one cache might be discovered and destroyed, a network of information scattered across the reservation that Jonas hoped would eventually form a complete picture of the corruption he'd uncovered. The most recent entry was dated 2 days ago, and its tone was different from the others. More resigned and final, as if whoever had written it, presumably Sarah based on the content, knew that their time was running out and wanted to make sure the information survived even if they didn't. "We can't keep doing this," the entry began, its words cutting through my professional detachment and hitting something deeper. Emma deserves a childhood, not this endless fear and hiding. Jonas deserves to rest, not to carry this burden until it kills him. I deserve to stop looking over my shoulder, wondering if today is the day they finally catch us. So we've decided to end it, one way or another. We're going to make sure the evidence gets found, even if we can't be there to explain it ourselves. Officer Begay seems like a good man, based on what we've been able to learn. He wasn't involved in the original investigation, which means he's probably not compromised. We're going to leave everything where he'll find it, and we're going to trust that he'll understand what it means and what to do with it. If you're reading this, Officer Begay, please protect our daughter. Please make sure Emma gets to have the life we tried to give her. Please don't let Jonas's discovery die with us. The entry ended there, with no explanation of what they meant by ending it, or where they'd gone after abandoning this chamber, and the silence that followed felt heavier than any of the words I'd read. Patricia and Robert were both reading over my shoulder, and I could feel the weight of their attention as they processed the same information I was struggling to understand. The realization that this family had orchestrated their own disappearance not once but twice. First, to escape the people who wanted them silenced, and now to ensure their evidence would be found even at the cost of their own safety or lives. The trust they'd placed in me, someone they'd apparently researched and selected without my knowledge or consent, felt like a burden I wasn't sure I was equipped to carry, but refusing it wasn't an option, not with a child's life potentially hanging in the balance. We emerged from the chamber into afternoon sunlight that felt almost offensively normal after the oppressive darkness and the weight of what we'd discovered, and I briefed the other officers on what we'd found while Patricia uploaded photographs from her camera to a secure server that would preserve the evidence, even if something happened to the physical devices. The FBI field agents were already en route, their estimated arrival time less than 2 hours away, but I couldn't wait that long to check the high school storage room that had been mentioned in the carved message. I left Robert in charge of the scene and took Patricia with me back to the vehicles, making the drive to Tuba City in record time, while my mind raced through possibilities and implications faster than I could fully process them. The high school principal, a woman named Margaret Sosi who'd held the position for the past decade, met us at the main entrance with a concerned expression that suggested Raya had communicated the urgency of our request without providing too many details. She led us through empty hallways that echoed with our footsteps, the building quiet during the afternoon hours, when students were in class and the usual chaos of teenage energy was temporarily contained, and down a stairwell to the basement level, where maintenance and storage areas occupied space that had probably once held industrial arts classrooms or shop facilities. Storage room 3B was at the end of a long corridor, secured with a heavy padlock that Margaret opened with a key from the massive ring she carried, and when she swung the door open, the smell of dust and old paper and chemical fire suppressant rolled out in a wave that made me cough. The room was packed floor to ceiling with boxes and filing cabinets, Decades worth of school records and administrative documents that should have been digitized or destroyed according to retention schedules, but had instead been forgotten in this basement tomb. Margaret explained that this had been Jonas Curley's domain, the storage areas he'd maintained and organized as part of his facility's management responsibilities, and that after his disappearance, no one had really taken over that particular duty, leaving these rooms to continue accumulating material without any real system or oversight. She asked if we needed her to stay while we searched, but I could tell she was uncomfortable with the implications of police investigating her school's storage areas. So I thanked her and said we'd lock up when we were finished, sending her back to her regular duties while Patricia and I began the daunting task of searching through years of accumulated bureaucratic debris. We started with the areas that looked most recently disturbed, boxes that had been moved or opened more recently than others based on the dust patterns and the condition of the cardboard. Patricia found the first significant item, a filing cabinet tucked in a back corner that had been partially hidden behind a stack of old textbooks, its drawers labeled with years that corresponded to a period about 15 years ago, when the reservation had seen a surge of development projects and resource extraction agreements. The drawers were locked, but the mechanism was old enough that I was able to force it open with a screwdriver from my equipment bag, revealing files that looked like they'd been preserved deliberately, each folder sealed in plastic and labeled with careful notation about its contents and significance. The files documented what Jonas Curley had apparently discovered, a systematic scheme involving tribal officials, outside corporations, and complicit government employees who'd worked together to approve resource extraction projects that violated environmental regulations and tribal sovereignty agreements. The scheme had been sophisticated, using shell companies and falsified impact studies to make it appear that proper procedures had been followed, when in reality the projects had been rushed through without genuine oversight or community input. The financial benefits had flowed primarily to a small group of individuals who'd divided millions of dollars in bribes and kickbacks, while the communities affected by the mining and drilling operations had seen minimal benefit and substantial harm to their land and water resources. What made the scheme particularly egregious was the time frame over which it had operated, stretching back more than 2 decades and involving hundreds of individual transactions and agreements that had collectively transferred enormous wealth from the reservation to private interests. Jonas had somehow pieced together this pattern from maintenance records and misfiled documents, spending what must have been months or years connecting dots that no one else had noticed because they were looking at individual projects rather than the systemic corruption underlying them. The files included names, dates, amounts, and documented connections between people who publicly had no relationship, but who privately were coordinating to exploit legal loopholes and jurisdictional ambiguities for personal profit. Patricia was photographing pages as fast as she could, while I continued pulling files from the cabinet, each drawer revealing another layer of corruption and another set of names that included people I recognized, some who were still in positions of authority, and others who'd retired or moved on to other opportunities. The scope was staggering, involving not just tribal officials but federal employees from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, state regulators who should have been providing oversight, and corporate executives from companies whose names were familiar from gas stations and utility bills. This wasn't just local corruption that could be addressed through tribal judicial systems. This was a federal case that would require resources and jurisdiction well beyond what our small department could provide. I was pulling files from the bottom drawer when my radio crackled again, that now familiar burst of static that made my hand freeze on the papers I was holding. This time, the static lasted longer, maybe 10 or 15 seconds, and in the confines of the storage room with no windows and only a single overhead light. The sound felt oppressive and wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. Patricia heard it too, her camera lowering as she turned to look at her own radio with an expression that mixed skepticism and unease. the look of someone trying to maintain rational explanations in the face of phenomena that resisted easy categorization. When the static finally cleared, there was a moment of silence, and then a voice, so faint I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it, whispered a single word: "Hurry." The urgency in that whispered command broke through whatever professional detachment I'd been maintaining, and I started pulling files faster, no longer carefully documenting each item, but just grabbing everything that looked significant and piling it on the floor for Patricia to photograph. We worked in silence, broken only by camera shutters and rustling paper, both of us driven by a sense that time was running out for reasons we didn't fully understand but couldn't ignore. The files painted a picture of corruption so pervasive and long-standing that it had become normalized. Part of the background noise of reservation politics that people accepted because they'd never seen evidence concrete enough to challenge it. But Jonas Curley had found that evidence, and it had cost him everything, except apparently his determination to make sure the truth survived. We'd been working for maybe 40 minutes when my phone rang, the normal ringtone jarring after the tension of the silent work and mysterious radio transmissions. It was one of the FBI agents who'd arrived at the sandstone formations, calling to inform me that they'd completed their initial survey of the chamber and wanted my assessment of the evidence we'd found there. I gave him a brief summary while Patricia continued photographing files, explaining about the timeline on the walls and the phone we'd unlocked, and the message that had directed us to this storage room. The agent listened without interrupting, then told me something that made my blood run cold. They'd brought in a forensic team with luminol and other detection equipment, and they'd found blood in the chamber. Not a large amount, but enough to suggest someone had been injured, the pattern suggesting it was relatively recent, within the last few days. The blood discovery changed the calculus of our investigation, transforming it from a cold case resurrection into an active search for people who might be injured and running out of time. I told the agent about the files we'd found and suggested he coordinate with tribal prosecutors to begin building a case. But my primary concern now was locating the Curley family before whatever had caused that blood in the chamber led to a worse outcome. Patricia and I packed up the most critical files, leaving the rest secured in the storage room for later retrieval, and headed back to the station to coordinate with the expanding team of federal agents and tribal officers who were converging on what had become the biggest case in reservation history. As we drove through Tuba City with boxes of evidence in the back seat, my radio silent for once without static or whispers, I thought about that message Sarah Curley had left in her phone, her plea to protect Emma and make sure the child had the life her parents had tried to give her. Somewhere in this vast landscape of desert and rock and hidden spaces, a family was running out of options and time, trusting that I would understand what they'd left behind and act on it fast enough to matter. The files we'd recovered would destroy careers and lead to prosecutions that would take years to complete, but that justice would be hollow if we couldn't find the people who'd sacrificed everything to make it possible. The FBI established a command center at our station within hours of my call, transforming the small conference room into a nerve center of laptops and whiteboards, and agents speaking in the clipped, efficient tones of people accustomed to handling cases that crossed jurisdictional boundaries and touched on federal crimes. Special Agent in Charge Marcus Silversmith, who'd driven up from the Flagstaff field office, took one look at the files Patricia and I had recovered from the high school storage room and immediately called in additional resources, forensic accountants and corruption specialists who could parse the complex financial transactions that Jonas Curley had documented with such meticulous care. Agent Silversmith was Navajo himself, born on the reservation, though he'd left for college and never really come back except for cases like this, and I could see the personal anger in his eyes as he reviewed evidence of tribal officials selling out their own people for bribes that probably seemed substantial in the moment, but were nothing compared to the wealth extracted by the corporations they'd enabled. I spent the first 2 hours giving statements and briefings to various teams, walking them through the timeline of discovery from the abandoned Honda to the chamber in the sandstone formations to the storage room files, while Patricia coordinated with tribal officers to establish search perimeters and checkpoints at major roads leading off the reservation. The blood found in the chamber had been sent for analysis, but preliminary field testing suggested it was human and relatively fresh, within 48 to 72 hours, based on the oxidation patterns and other factors the forensic technician had explained in more detail than I really needed. What mattered was that someone from the Curley family, or possibly someone else connected to the case, had been injured recently enough that they might still be within reach if we moved fast and deployed resources intelligently. The challenge was that the reservation covered more than 27,000 square miles of some of the most rugged and remote terrain in North America, with countless places where a family could hide or where bodies could be concealed for decades without discovery. Agent Silversmith approved the use of helicopters for aerial reconnaissance, focusing on areas within a reasonable distance from the sandstone formations where we'd found the chamber, operating on the assumption that whoever had been living there wouldn't have traveled far before abandoning it. But I had a different theory based on the pattern of evidence we'd uncovered, the deliberate placement of the Honda where it would be found, the specific mention of my name in multiple locations, the careful documentation of corruption spanning 2 decades. This wasn't random or desperate flight. This was orchestrated revelation, a family that had spent 6 years planning how to expose the truth while protecting themselves, and they wouldn't have abandoned their plan at the final stage without good reason. My radio crackled as I was studying maps in the command center, trying to identify locations that fit the profile of places the Curley family might have chosen for their final stand or their final hiding place. The static was brief this time, barely a second, but it was followed by something new. Not a whisper or a single word, but what sounded like 2 voices speaking over each other, too garbled and overlapped for me to distinguish individual words, but unmistakably human and unmistakably urgent. Patricia, who was standing nearby coordinating with search teams, heard it too and came over immediately, asking if I'd been able to make out what the voices were saying, but I had to shake my head because the transmission had been too corrupted to parse any meaning from beyond the raw emotion of fear and desperation. Agent Silversmith noticed our distracted attention to the radios and asked what was going on, so I explained about the static and the whispered transmissions that had been occurring throughout the investigation, expecting him to dismiss it as equipment malfunction or atmospheric interference. Instead, he surprised me by nodding thoughtfully and saying he'd experienced similar phenomena on other cases involving the reservation. Transmissions that couldn't be explained by normal radio theory but that seemed to correlate with significant developments in investigations. He didn't offer any explanation for what might cause such transmissions, just acknowledged that they happened and suggested we treat them as potential intelligence regardless of their source, which struck me as a remarkably open-minded position for a federal agent who presumably dealt in evidence and facts rather than unexplained phenomena. The breakthrough came not from the radio transmissions or the aerial searches, but from a phone call to the tip line that Rhea Yazzie had been monitoring while coordinating dispatch operations and managing the increased communication traffic generated by the expanded investigation. A gas station attendant in Cameron, a small community about 40 miles south of Tuba City, had called to report that a woman matching Sarah Curley's description had come in 2 days ago to buy first aid supplies, antiseptic and bandages and pain medication, paying cash and seeming nervous and hurried. The attendant, whose name was Douglas Benally, hadn't thought much of it at the time because people got injured doing ranch work or hiking all the time. But after seeing news coverage of the investigation, he'd started to wonder if the woman might have been connected to the case. I took Patricia and drove to Cameron immediately, leaving the FBI to continue processing the storage room files and coordinating the broader search operation, because this felt like a lead that required personal follow-up rather than impersonal coordination through layers of bureaucracy. The drive took less than an hour on roads that cut through landscape that shifted from high desert scrubland to the beginnings of the painted desert. Bands of colored stone stretching toward horizons that seemed impossibly distant under the vast dome of sky. Douglas Benally was in his early 20s, working the afternoon shift at a gas station that served primarily as a pit stop for tourists heading to or from the Grand Canyon. And when we arrived, he was eager to help, pulling up security footage on a computer behind the counter that showed grainy black and white images of customers coming and going over the past week. The footage from 2 days ago showed a woman who could have been Sarah Curley, the right height and build based on the photographs we'd been circulating, though the camera angle and image quality made positive identification impossible. She'd spent about 10 minutes in the store, methodically selecting items from the first aid aisle in the food section, moving with the careful deliberation of someone operating under stress but trying to appear normal. What caught my attention was a moment near the end of her visit when she'd paused at the coffee counter, staring at something outside the frame of the camera, her body language shifting from controlled tension to visible fear. She'd abandoned the coffee she'd been pouring and hurried to the register, paying quickly and leaving without waiting for her change. I asked Douglas if he remembered what she might have been looking at, what had caused that sudden shift in behavior, and he thought for a moment before nodding and saying there'd been a truck parked outside. Dark blue or black. Older model with windows tinted dark enough that you couldn't see who was inside. He'd noticed it because the driver hadn't come in to buy anything, just sat there for the entire time the woman had been in the store, and had pulled out right after she'd left, following her vehicle south toward Flagstaff. Douglas hadn't gotten a plate number but thought the truck might have been a Chevrolet or GMC from the 90s based on the body style, which wasn't much to go on but was better than nothing, and he provided a description detailed enough that we could at least put out an alert to watch for vehicles matching that profile. The direction of travel, south toward Flagstaff rather than back north toward Tuba City, was interesting because it suggested Sarah, if that's who the woman had been, wasn't returning to the chamber in the sandstone formations, but was heading somewhere else entirely. Patricia pulled up maps on her phone, tracing possible routes from Cameron south and identifying locations that might serve as hiding places or meeting points, but the options were too numerous to narrow down without additional information. I was about to thank Douglas and head back to coordinate with the search teams when he mentioned one more detail that changed my understanding of the situation. The woman had asked him for directions to a specific location, an old trading post near Gray Mountain that had been closed for years, but the people sometimes used for shelter or as a waypoint when traveling across the reservation. The Gray Mountain trading post was about 20 miles south of Cameron, located at a crossroads that had once been significant when the trading post economy was thriving, but that had been bypassed by newer highways and left to decay into picturesque ruin. I knew the location because I'd responded to calls there before. Mostly transients camping in the abandoned buildings or teenagers using it as a party spot, and it fit the profile of places the Curley family had been using based on the pattern we'd established from the chamber and other evidence. Patricia called ahead to request backup to meet us there, but I didn't want to wait for a full tactical response that might take hours to organize. So we headed out immediately with the understanding that we were potentially walking into a situation where the family might be present and might be accompanied or pursued by whoever had been involved in the corruption they'd exposed. The drive to Gray Mountain took us through increasingly desolate landscape, the kind of terrain where cell service was non-existent, and the next gas station or human habitation might be 50 miles in any direction. The old trading post came into view as we crested a rise, a cluster of weathered buildings surrounding a main structure that had once been painted red, but had faded to a rust color that blended with the surrounding rock formations. Several vehicles were parked near the buildings, including a silver Honda that made my pulse quicken because it matched the description of the car, registered to Marcus Whitehorse, but that we'd theorized might have been driven by someone connected to the Curley family. The dark truck Douglas had mentioned wasn't visible, but that didn't mean it wasn't there. Possibly parked behind one of the outbuildings, or hidden in one of the many gullies and washes that made this area perfect for concealment. We approached carefully, parking our vehicle at a distance that gave us cover, but still allowed clear lines of sight to the main buildings, and I radioed our position to dispatch while Patricia used binoculars to scan for any signs of movement or occupation. The trading post looked abandoned at first glance, windows broken and doors hanging open, but there were signs that people had been here recently, tire tracks in the dirt that looked fresh, disturbed dust patterns around the entrances, and what might have been smoke residue on one of the chimneys suggesting someone had lit a fire within the past day or two. I was debating our approach strategy when my radio erupted with static so intense that I actually dropped the handset. The sound painful enough that both Patricia and I had to cover our ears until it subsided after what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds. When the static cleared, a voice came through with surprising clarity. No whisper or garbled transmission, but actual words spoken in what sounded like a child's voice, high and frightened and desperate. "Officer Begay, they're here. They found us. Daddy says hide the evidence even if they find us. Please hurry, please." The transmission cut off as abruptly as it had begun, leaving Patricia and me staring at each other in shock, because that had been undeniably Emma Curley's voice, or at least a child's voice that knew my name and knew about evidence and was calling for help from a location that had to be the trading post, because that's where we were and where the transmission had seemed to originate. The rational part of my mind tried to construct explanations. Maybe someone in the trading post had accessed our radio frequency and was transmitting deliberately. Maybe this was an elaborate setup or trap. But the emotional impact of hearing a terrified child calling my name overrode those rational considerations. We moved toward the trading post with weapons drawn, using the cover of abandoned vehicles and outbuildings to approach the main structure without exposing ourselves to potential fire from windows or other vantage points. The silence was oppressive. No birds or insects or even wind, just the sound of our boots on hard-packed dirt and our own breathing harsh in our ears. Patricia took the rear entrance while I approached the front, counting down on hand signals before we both breached simultaneously, entering a large room that had once been the main retail space of the trading post but now held only debris and evidence of transient occupation. Sleeping bags and trash and graffiti covering walls that still showed faded advertisements for products that hadn't been manufactured in decades. The room was empty of people, but there was clear evidence that someone had been here very recently. A camping stove still warm to the touch, food wrappers and water bottles that looked like they'd been discarded within the hour, and most significantly, blood on the floor in a pattern that suggested someone had been sitting or lying in that spot for an extended period. Patricia called out that the back rooms were also empty, and we were beginning a more systematic search of the building when we heard vehicles approaching from the direction we'd come. Multiple engines moving fast enough to kick up dust clouds visible through the broken windows. For a moment, I thought backup had arrived earlier than expected, but the vehicles weren't marked patrol units. They were civilian trucks and SUVs, 3 of them forming a loose semicircle around the trading post and blocking our escape route back to where we'd left our vehicle. Men emerged from the trucks, 6 of them that I could count, all wearing casual clothing that could have belonged to ranchers or construction workers. Nothing obviously threatening, except for the way they moved with coordinated purpose and the fact that several were carrying rifles or shotguns held in that casual, ready position that suggested familiarity and willingness to use them. One man, older than the others with gray hair and a weathered face that I recognized from the photographs in Jonas Curley's files, stepped forward and called out in a voice that carried clearly across the distance. "Officer Begay, we need to talk. You've been looking for something that doesn't concern you. Put down your weapons and come out, and maybe we can resolve this without anyone getting hurt." I recognized the man as Randall Tsosi, a name that had appeared multiple times in the corruption files as a facilitator and middleman who'd coordinated between tribal officials and the corporations seeking resource extraction rights. He'd been on the tribal council for 2 terms before retiring 5 years ago, and based on the documentation Jonas had compiled, he'd personally profited by at least $2 million from bribes and kickbacks over a 15-year period. The fact that he was here personally, rather than sending hired muscle or working through intermediaries, suggested either he was desperate enough to take direct action, or he was confident enough in his position that he didn't fear consequences, and neither option made me feel better about our current situation. Patricia and I had taken cover behind a fallen beam that provided some protection from the entrance, and I keyed my radio to call for immediate backup, speaking as quietly as I could while still being heard by dispatch. Rhea Yazzi's voice came back immediately, confirming that she'd received my call and that units were being dispatched, but also warning me that response time would be at least 30 minutes given our remote location. 30 minutes was an eternity in a standoff situation, plenty of time for everything to go wrong in every possible way, and I had to make a decision about whether to try to hold out until backup arrived, or to attempt some kind of negotiation that might buy us time, or might just give Tsosi and his associates the opportunity to neutralize us before witnesses arrived. I called back to Tsosi, asking what he wanted to talk about, and his response was both straightforward and chilling. The files that Jonas Curley stole from the storage room. The evidence he thought he could use to destroy good people who were just trying to bring prosperity to the reservation. We want those files, and we want your assurance that this investigation ends today. In return, everyone walks away. You go back to Tuba City, we go back to our lives, and the Curley family, or what's left of them, gets left alone to live somewhere far from here where they can't cause any more problems. The implication was clear. They knew where the Curley family was, possibly had them in custody or under surveillance, and were offering their safety as leverage to get us to back down from the investigation. The problem with Tsosi's offer, beyond the obvious issue that I wasn't about to compromise a federal investigation involving systematic corruption and possible kidnapping, was that the files were already in FBI custody and had been copied and distributed to multiple secure locations specifically to prevent the kind of suppression he was proposing. Even if I wanted to accept his deal, which I didn't, there was no practical way to put the evidence back in its box and pretend it hadn't been found. I tried to explain this to Tsosi, speaking loudly enough that my voice would carry across the open space between us, but he just shook his head and said, "Then we have a problem, Officer Begay, because those files are going to destroy people I care about, people who've given their lives to serving this community, and I can't let that happen. So either you figure out a way to make them disappear, or we're going to have to make you disappear instead." The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and I was running through tactical options in my head when my radio crackled again. Not with static this time, but with a transmission that cut through all the other frequencies and played simultaneously on what sounded like every radio within range, including apparently the radios that Tsosi's men were carrying based on the way several of them grabbed at their equipment. The transmission was clear and strong, Jonas Curley's voice unmistakable even though I'd never heard him speak in life, only seen photographs and read his documentation. "Randall, this ends today. I've recorded everything, every meeting, every payment, every threat you've made to keep people quiet. It's all uploaded to cloud servers with instructions to release everything if anything happens to my family or to the officers investigating this case. You want to kill me? Fine. But you can't kill the truth anymore. It's out there now, beyond your reach." Tsosi's face went pale, and he barked orders to his men who spread out and began searching the area, looking for wherever Jonas might be transmitting from, but I had a strong suspicion that the transmission wasn't coming from any physical location nearby. The voice had that same quality as the earlier whispered words and static bursts, as if it was coming from somewhere that didn't quite align with normal space or normal radio frequencies, and whether that meant Jonas was using sophisticated equipment to mask his location or something stranger was happening, I couldn't begin to guess. What mattered was that the transmission had bought us time and had shifted the tactical situation by making Sosi uncertain about whether killing us would actually accomplish his goals or would just trigger the release of additional evidence that would destroy him more thoroughly than the files we'd already recovered. Patricia took advantage of the confusion to move to a better defensive position near a window that gave her clear lines of fire to 2 of the 3 vehicles, and I covered her movement while keeping my own weapon trained on Sosi and the man closest to him. The standoff had reached a critical point where any sudden movement or miscalculation could trigger violence that would likely leave some or all of us dead, and I found myself praying for backup to arrive before someone made the wrong decision. My prayer was answered not by the arrival of additional tribal officers, but by another radio transmission, this time in Sarah Curley's voice, speaking with the controlled intensity of someone who'd reached the absolute limit of fear and desperation and come out the other side. Randall Sosi, you took 6 years of our lives. You made us fugitives in our own homeland. You terrorized our daughter and destroyed our family. But we're done running, and we're done being afraid. Officer Begay has the evidence. The FBI has the evidence. Your friends at the BIA can't protect you anymore. So either you leave right now and turn yourself in to federal authorities, or we release everything, every name, every crime, every piece of leverage you've been using to keep people silent. Your choice. The transmission ended, and for a long moment nobody moved, everyone waiting to see how Sosi would respond to this ultimatum delivered from somewhere in the electronic ether by people who'd become ghosts haunting their own investigation. I could see Sosi calculating, weighing his options, and probably realizing that whatever control he'd thought he had over the situation had evaporated the moment Jonas and Sarah had demonstrated that they could reach out and touch the investigation from wherever they were hiding. The corruption network that had operated for 2 decades in the shadows had depended on silence and fear and the ability to make problems disappear before they became public. But the Curley family had systematically dismantled those protections. And now, Sosi was standing in the ruins of what had once been an untouchable empire of graft and exploitation. He made his decision, lowering his rifle and gesturing to his men to do the same. And when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of defeat. This isn't over, Officer Begay. You think you've won something today, but all you've done is tear apart a system that was working, that was bringing jobs and development to people who needed both. The corporations were going to extract those resources one way or another. At least our way, some of the money stayed here, benefited our people. Now, it's all going to go to lawyers and federal prosecutions. And in 5 years, when the dust settles, the reservation will be poorer, and our people will be unemployed. And you'll realize that sometimes corruption is better than the alternative. He climbed back into his truck, his men following his lead, and the convoy pulled away heading south toward the junction with Highway 89, leaving Patricia and me standing in the ruins of the trading post, trying to process what had just happened. The backup units arrived 15 minutes later, a tactical team from the tribal police, along with FBI agents who'd been monitoring the radio traffic and had mobilized as soon as Rhea relayed my distress call. Agent Silversmith emerged from one of the vehicles looking grim, and when I briefed him on the confrontation and Sosi's threats, he immediately ordered arrest warrants to be issued for everyone involved in the standoff. But his attention was focused less on the immediate tactical situation and more on the radio transmissions, the voices of Jonas and Sarah Curley that had intervened at critical moments to provide intelligence and leverage that had potentially saved Patricia's and my lives. He asked me detailed questions about the quality of the transmissions, the timing, the specific content, and when I'd finished describing what we'd heard, he nodded slowly and said, "They're close." probably within visual range of this location. They've been watching the whole time, maybe with binoculars or a spotting scope, and they've been using some kind of radio equipment to monitor our frequencies and inject their own transmissions at strategic moments. The explanation made sense from a technical perspective, and it was certainly more comfortable than the alternatives my imagination had been suggesting, but something about it didn't quite fit with the pattern of transmissions we'd been receiving throughout the investigation. The whispered name in the early morning hours when I'd first discovered the Honda, the static bursts that had seemed to know when we were on the verge of important discoveries, the child's voice calling for help just as we were approaching the trading post, all of it had a quality of immediacy and impossible knowledge that suggested something beyond simple radio communication and surveillance. But I kept these thoughts to myself, because expressing doubts about the rational explanation would only make me sound like I was losing my grip on reality, and I needed to maintain credibility if I was going to see this investigation through to its conclusion. The forensic team that had accompanied the tactical unit began processing the trading post, collecting blood samples and fingerprints and documenting the evidence of recent occupation that Patricia and I had observed. The blood matched samples from the chamber in the sandstone formations based on preliminary field analysis, confirming that the Curley family or someone closely connected to them had been using this location recently and had been injured, though whether that injury was serious enough to require immediate medical attention remained unclear. What was clear was that we were following a trail that had been deliberately laid out for us, breadcrumbs of evidence and radio transmissions guiding us from location to location, revealing the scope of corruption while keeping the family itself always just beyond our reach. I was helping catalog items found in the trading post when my radio crackled one more time. This transmission different from all the others because it came through normal channels without static or distortion, just a standard call from Rhea Yazzie back at dispatch. Her voice was tight with controlled excitement as she relayed information that shifted the investigation yet again. "Lennox, we just received a call from a lawyer in Flagstaff representing Jonas and Sarah Curley. They're alive, they're safe, and they're ready to give testimony, but only if we can guarantee their protection and Emma's safety. The lawyer is en route with them now, estimated arrival at the station in 90 minutes. And Lennox, there's more. The lawyer says they have additional evidence, recordings, and documents they've been holding in reserve. Things they didn't hide in the chamber or the storage room because they were too sensitive to risk being found before the timing was right. They're ready to release it all, but they want assurances from federal prosecutors first." The news should have filled me with relief, but instead I felt a strange mixture of emotions. Satisfaction that the family had survived and would finally be able to tell their story, but also a kind of melancholy about the journey they'd been forced to take, and the cost they'd paid for their determination to expose corruption that most people would have simply accepted and tried to work around. 6 years of living in hiding, constantly moving, watching their daughter grow up in fear and isolation, all because Jonas Curley had found files in a storage room and made the decision that truth mattered more than personal safety or comfort. The courage that required, or perhaps the stubbornness, or perhaps just the moral clarity to see injustice and refuse to accept it, was simultaneously inspiring and heartbreaking. Patricia and I completed our work at the trading post and headed back toward Tuba City, driving through landscape that looked different in the afternoon light, less ominous and more beautiful. The play of shadows on red rock and the vast sweep of sky reminding me why people fought so hard to protect this land and why corporations wanted so badly to exploit its resources. Agent Silversmith had gone ahead with most of his team to prepare for the Curleys' arrival, coordinating with federal prosecutors and establishing security protocols to ensure that the family couldn't be targeted or silenced before they had a chance to testify. The arrest warrants for Randall Sosi and his associates were being executed simultaneously across multiple locations, a coordinated sweep designed to prevent anyone from fleeing or destroying additional evidence before the scope of their crimes became public. As we drove, I thought about Sosi's parting words, his claim that the corruption network had actually benefited the reservation by ensuring that at least some of the money from resource extraction stayed local, rather than being entirely siphoned off by outside corporations. It was a seductive argument, the kind of moral complexity that made people hesitate to oppose systems they knew were unjust, but that seemed to offer practical benefits that wouldn't exist under a more rigid adherence to law and regulation. But it was also fundamentally a lie, because the files Jonas had documented showed clearly that the vast majority of profits had gone to corporations and to a small group of corrupt officials, while the communities actually affected by mining and drilling had seen minimal benefit and substantial harm to their land, water, and traditional ways of life. We were about 10 miles from Tuba City when my radio crackled one final time, and I braced myself for another burst of static or another whispered message, but what came through was just a simple transmission in Emma Curley's voice, clear and unmistakable. "Officer Begay, this is Emma. My daddy says thank you for finding the evidence. He says you're a good man and he's sorry he had to make you part of this. I'm 10 now, not 4 anymore. I don't really remember what it was like before, but Mommy says we're going to get to go home now. I hope that's true. Thank you for believing us." The transmission ended, and this time there was no static afterward, just clean silence that felt somehow final, as if whatever channel had been open between us and the Curley family throughout this investigation had finally closed, now that their story was about to be told in person, rather than through mysterious transmissions and carefully hidden evidence. Patricia looked at me, and I saw my own emotional response reflected in her expression. That combination of professional satisfaction and personal connection that made certain cases stay with you long after the paperwork was filed and the prosecutions completed. We'd been chosen by this family, selected somehow through means I still didn't fully understand, to be the instruments of revelation and justice, and that trust carried responsibility that would extend beyond this investigation into whatever came next. The Curleys would need protection not just during the trial but afterward, because people like Randall Sosi didn't forget or forgive, and the corruption network we'd exposed had roots deep enough that cutting off its visible branches wouldn't necessarily kill the entire organism. The station was controlled chaos when we arrived, federal agents and tribal officers coordinating logistics, while media relations staff prepared statements about arrests and ongoing investigations that couldn't include too much detail without compromising prosecutions, but needed to include enough to satisfy public interest in what was already being called the biggest corruption case in reservation history. Agent Silversmith had established a secure area in the back of the station where the Curleys would be brought when they arrived, separate from the main booking and interview rooms to minimize their exposure to anyone who might wish them harm or might be working with the conspiracy we'd uncovered. I was escorted to that secure area along with Patricia, both of us designated as primary tribal police liaisons to the family, based on our role in discovering and following the evidence trail they'd left. The lawyer arrived first, a woman named Jennifer Begay, who was no relation to me despite sharing a common surname, and she briefed us on her client's condition and demands before they were brought in. Jonas Curley was suffering from multiple health issues related to 6 years of inadequate medical care and the stress of constant flight and hiding. Nothing immediately life-threatening, but conditions that required ongoing treatment he hadn't been able to access while living off the grid. Sarah Curley was physically healthy but emotionally exhausted, the toll of protecting her family while maintaining the evidence collection and documentation visible in every aspect of her demeanor, according to Jennifer. Emma Curley was the biggest concern, a child who'd spent more than half her life in hiding, who'd missed school and social development and all the normal experiences of childhood, and who would need extensive counseling and support to recover from trauma that couldn't be undone no matter how successfully the prosecution proceeded. When the family finally entered the secure area, escorted by federal marshals who'd picked them up from a location Jennifer wouldn't disclose, I was struck by how ordinary they looked. Just a tired family who could have been any of the thousands of families living on the reservation, dealing with poverty and limited opportunities, and the grinding pressure of trying to survive in circumstances that offered few easy paths forward. Jonas looked older than his photographs, gray-haired and thin in a way that suggested recent weight loss or chronic illness, but his eyes were sharp and focused when they met mine, recognizing me somehow despite us never having met before. Sarah was holding Emma's hand, and the girl was exactly what you'd expect from a 10-year-old who'd been through incomprehensible stress, quiet and watchful and carrying herself with a caution that should have been unnecessary at her age, but that had probably kept her alive during the years her family had spent evading people who would have killed them without hesitation. Jonas spoke first, his voice carrying the hoarse quality of someone who wasn't accustomed to speaking freely or loudly. "Officer Begay, I know this has been confusing, the way we left evidence and the radio transmissions and everything else. We didn't have a choice about any of it. Once we found those files and realized what they documented, once we understood that people we'd trusted were willing to kill to protect their corruption, we couldn't just walk into a police station and file a report. We had to assume that the network had reach into every level of authority, that turning to the wrong person would get us killed before we could expose what we'd found. So we ran, and we documented, and we waited for the right moment and the right person to reveal everything to. You were that person, Officer Begay. We researched you, watched you, verified that you weren't connected to any of the people in the files, and when we were sure, we set this whole thing in motion." I wanted to ask how they'd managed the radio transmissions, how they'd known where I was and what I was doing at specific moments throughout the investigation. But before I could form the questions, Emma tugged on her father's sleeve and whispered something I couldn't quite hear. Jonas smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his worn face into something younger and more hopeful, and he said, "Emma wants you to know that she was the one who left the drawing in the car. She made it when she was 4, before everything happened, and we kept it all these years as a reminder of what we were fighting for, the chance for her to have a normal life again. She wanted you to find it first, before anything else, so you'd know this was about a real family, not just files and evidence." The gesture was simultaneously heartbreaking and beautiful, a child's artwork transformed into a beacon calling for rescue across 6 years of suffering. The testimony began the following morning in a federal courthouse in Flagstaff, where Jonas and Sarah Curley spent 8 hours walking prosecutors through the evidence they'd compiled over 6 years of living in shadows, their voices steady despite the emotional weight of reliving trauma that had consumed more than half their daughter's childhood. I sat in the observation room with Patricia and Agent Silversmith, watching through one-way glass as Jonas explained how he'd first discovered the files while doing routine maintenance in the high school storage room, finding boxes that had been mislabeled and filed in the wrong location, probably during some administrative reorganization that had accidentally preserved documents meant to have been destroyed decades earlier. The files had detailed resource extraction agreements that Jonas, despite having no formal training in law or environmental regulation, had recognized as problematic because they referenced locations and permits he knew didn't exist, or had been obtained through processes that violated both tribal sovereignty and federal environmental protection statutes. What had started as curiosity about administrative irregularities had become something darker when Jonas mentioned his discovery to a colleague, a teacher who'd worked at the school for 30 years and who'd seemed genuinely interested in helping Jonas understand what he'd found. Within 24 hours of that conversation, Jonas's home had been broken into while the family was away, Nothing stolen but Emma's toys arranged in a pattern that was clearly deliberate. A warning that couldn't be misinterpreted. Sarah testified about the escalating sense of being watched that had followed. Strange vehicles parked near their home at odd hours. Phone calls that connected but where no one spoke. Encounters with people who asked too many questions about their routines and schedules. They'd gone to local tribal police initially, filing reports that had been taken seriously but hadn't led to any arrests or even identification of suspects. And in retrospect, Sarah believed that some of the officers they'd spoken with had been compromised or had inadvertently shared information with people connected to the corruption network. The decision to run had come after Sarah found a note taped to Emma's bedroom window one night. Simple words that carried unmistakable threat. "Stop asking questions, or we'll make sure Emma doesn't get to ask any." They'd packed what they could fit in their Ford Explorer and left that same night, telling no one where they were going because they couldn't be certain who might pass that information along to people who wished them harm. The first year had been the hardest, Sarah explained, as they'd exhausted their savings quickly and had to find ways to survive without accessing bank accounts or credit cards that could be traced. Jonas had worked odd jobs under assumed names, construction and landscaping work that paid cash and didn't require background checks, while Sarah had homeschooled Emma using materials bought at thrift stores or borrowed from libraries, trying to give their daughter some semblance of normal education despite circumstances that were anything but normal. The testimony about their methods of survival and evidence collection was fascinating in its detail, revealing a level of planning and determination that seemed almost impossible for ordinary people without training in intelligence operations or law enforcement. Jonas had taught himself basic surveillance detection and counter-surveillance techniques from library books and internet research accessed through public computers, learning to spot when they were being followed and how to lose tails without making it obvious they'd detected the surveillance. Sarah had become expert at finding sympathetic people who'd rent them temporary housing without requiring identification or standard rental agreements, usually offering to do property maintenance or other work in exchange for reduced rent and flexibility about paperwork. And Emma, in ways that were both heartbreaking and admirable, had adapted to constant movement and assumed identities with resilience that suggested either remarkable strength or trauma responses that would require years of therapy to fully process. The evidence collection had been systematic despite their chaotic lifestyle, with Jonas making periodic trips back to the reservation to document new developments in the corruption schemes he'd originally uncovered, and to gather additional files and photographs that filled in gaps in the pattern he'd identified. He'd used disposable cameras bought at convenience stores and had developed the film at different locations to avoid creating patterns that might be noticed, building physical files that he'd hidden in multiple locations across the reservation, against the possibility that one cache might be discovered or destroyed. The chamber in the sandstone formations had been one of several safe houses they'd maintained, returning to it periodically when they needed to review evidence or plan their next moves, and the writing on the walls had served as both documentation and catharsis, a way to process the enormity of what they were dealing with while maintaining focus on their ultimate goal of exposing the corruption. But it was Sarah's testimony about why they'd chosen me specifically as the target for their revelation that made my skin crawl with implications I was still processing hours after hearing it. She explained that they'd spent more than a year researching tribal police officers, looking for someone who met specific criteria they'd developed, relatively new to the force, so less likely to have been corrupted or compromised. No family connections to anyone named in the files Jonas had discovered. A reputation for honesty and thoroughness based on public records and conversations Sarah had carefully conducted with people who'd interacted with various officers. My name had emerged from that research as their best option, and they'd spent months studying my patterns and routines, learning where I lived and worked, what cases I'd handled and how I'd approached them. building a profile that convinced them I was trustworthy and capable of understanding what they needed to reveal. The disturbing part, the detail that Sarah delivered with apologetic hesitation, was that they'd been watching me for more than 6 months before they'd finally executed their plan to draw me into the investigation. The abandoned Honda hadn't been discovered by accident or random chance, but had been placed specifically where morning patrol routes would lead me to find it, timed to occur after a storm that would provide plausible explanation for why someone might have gotten stuck in that location. The evidence left in the vehicle, the registration in Jonas's name and the child's drawing in the files, had all been carefully curated to create a trail I would follow. Each piece designed to lead to the next discovery in a sequence that would build understanding while protecting the family until they were ready to emerge from hiding. Even the radio transmissions, which I'd experienced as mysterious and possibly supernatural, had been the result of sophisticated equipment Jonas had acquired and learned to use, allowing him to monitor police frequencies and inject transmissions at strategic moments to guide the investigation. Agent Silversmith asked the question I was thinking. How did you know Officer Begay would be the one to respond to the vehicle? How could you be certain he'd follow the evidence trail exactly as you'd planned? Sarah's answer was both logical and unsettling, explaining that they'd actually prepared multiple versions of the evidence trail for different officers, each customized to that officer's specific patterns and psychology based on their research. The version I'd encountered had been designed for me, but if Patricia Littlecrow or one of the other officers they'd profiled had been the first responder, they would have found a different sequence of clues calibrated to their particular strengths and tendencies. The level of preparation and manipulation involved was staggering, suggesting either obsessive dedication or deteriorating mental state, and I found myself wondering whether the Curley family's 6 years on the run had damaged them in ways that wouldn't become fully apparent until long after this investigation concluded. Jonas's testimony about the corruption itself was comprehensive and damning, walking prosecutors through specific transactions and agreements that had enriched tribal officials and outside corporations while leaving communities vulnerable to environmental damage and resource depletion. He'd documented at least 40 separate schemes spanning 2 decades, involving uranium mining, coal extraction, water rights transfers, and land leases that violated both tribal sovereignty and federal environmental protections. The financial benefits to individuals like Randall Tsosi had been substantial. Millions of dollars in bribes and kickbacks disguised as consulting fees and development incentives, but the cost to the reservation had been far greater, including contaminated water sources, degraded grazing lands, and displacement of families who'd lived in affected areas for generations. The corporations involved were major energy and mining companies with national and international reach, and the prosecution of this case would likely take years and involve hundreds of defendants across multiple jurisdictions. The additional evidence that Jonas and Sarah had kept in reserve, the recordings and documents they'd mentioned through their lawyer, proved to be even more explosive than the files we'd recovered from the high school storage room. Jonas had managed to record actual conversations between corrupt officials and corporate representatives, using equipment he'd hidden in locations where such meetings typically occurred, and those recordings captured explicit discussions of bribery and schemes to evade regulations and oversight. Some of the recordings included voices of federal officials from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, who were supposed to be protecting tribal interests but who'd instead been facilitating the exploitation, and their involvement elevated the case to a level that would attract national attention and possibly trigger congressional investigations into systematic failures of federal trust responsibilities. The prosecutions began within weeks, with Randall Tsosi and 17 other defendants facing federal charges that included conspiracy, bribery, environmental crimes, and violations of laws protecting indigenous rights and resources. The trials would take years to complete, but the evidence Jonas and Sarah had compiled was so comprehensive that most defendants eventually accepted plea agreements rather than face juries that would hear their own voices on recordings discussing schemes to defraud and exploit their own communities. The corruption network that had operated for 2 decades in shadows and silence was being dismantled piece by piece, and while the process was slow and frustrating, there was genuine satisfaction in watching justice move forward with methodical inevitability. But it was the personal aftermath, the impact on the Curley family and on my own understanding of what had happened during the investigation, that haunted me in the months following their testimony. The family was placed in witness protection initially, moved to a location outside Arizona where they could begin rebuilding lives that had been shattered by Jonas's decision to expose corruption rather than ignore it. Emma was enrolled in counseling and eventually in a school where she could interact with peers and experience something approaching normal childhood, though her therapists warned that she would likely carry trauma from her 6 years in hiding throughout her life. Sarah found work teaching again, using her real name for the first time in years, while Jonas struggled with health issues that had worsened during their time on the run, chronic conditions that should have been treated years earlier but that he'd ignored in favor of maintaining their survival and their mission. I stayed in contact with the family through their lawyer, receiving occasional updates about their progress and their adjustment to life without constant fear, and those updates were simultaneously encouraging and heartbreaking. Emma was thriving in some ways, making friends and catching up academically, but she also had nightmares and trust issues that manifested in difficulty forming attachments to anyone outside her immediate family. Sarah was grateful for the opportunity to teach again, but found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, unable to fully accept that the threat had passed and that they were finally safe. And Jonas, despite his health problems, was already talking about writing a book or developing educational materials to help other communities identify and resist corruption schemes, unable to let go of the mission that had defined and nearly destroyed his family. The updates I valued most were the ones that included messages from Emma, usually brief notes or drawings that her mother would photograph and send through Jennifer Begay. The drawings showed typical childhood subjects, houses and families and animals, but they also frequently included images of police officers and radios and deserts, as if Emma was processing her experiences through art the way her father had processed them through documentation and evidence collection. One drawing in particular stayed with me, showing a small figure standing in darkness, while a larger figure with a flashlight approached from a distance. And when Sarah sent that image, she included a note explaining that Emma had said it represented the moment she'd known they would be rescued, when she'd heard my name on her father's radio and understood that someone was finally following the trail her family had left. But there were aspects of the case that never quite made sense. Details that bothered me, even as official investigations concluded and defendants were sentenced, and the media moved on to other stories. The radio transmissions remained the biggest puzzle, because while Sarah's explanation about sophisticated equipment and monitoring police frequencies was technically plausible, it didn't account for several specific instances where the transmissions had contained information the family shouldn't have been able to access. The whispered name in the early morning when I'd first discovered the Honda, for example, had occurred before I'd radioed my location to dispatch, meaning Jonas and Sarah couldn't have known I was the responding officer unless they'd been physically present and watching, which seemed unlikely given the timing and the remote location. The transmission with Emma's voice calling for help had come through all active radios simultaneously, including units that were on different channels and frequencies, something that should have been technically impossible with the equipment Sarah described Jonas using. I asked Agent Silversmith about these inconsistencies during one of our debriefing sessions, expecting him to dismiss my concerns as unimportant details in an otherwise successful investigation, but instead he'd grown quiet and thoughtful before finally saying, There are aspects of working on the reservation that don't fit normal frameworks, Officer Beachy. I've been with the Bureau for 20 years, and I've seen things during cases here that I couldn't explain and wouldn't include in official reports because they'd make me sound unstable. Radio phenomena that shouldn't be possible. Witnesses who know things they shouldn't be able to know. Evidence that appears in locations we've already searched multiple times. I stopped trying to understand it years ago and just learned to accept that some investigations have elements that resist rational explanation. His acknowledgement of unexplained phenomena was oddly reassuring, confirming that I wasn't the only person who'd experienced things during investigations that couldn't be easily categorized or dismissed. But it also opened unsettling questions about the nature of what I'd experienced and what it might mean for future cases. If the radio transmissions hadn't been entirely the result of Jonas's sophisticated equipment, if there had been some other factor involved that allowed the family to reach out across distance and circumstance in ways that transcended normal communication, then what did that suggest about the landscape we were working in and the forces that might be active but invisible to normal investigation methods? I didn't have answers, and increasingly I suspected there weren't answers, at least not ones that would fit into official reports or courtroom testimony. 3 months after the initial testimony, I received a package at the station with no return address, postmarked from a city I knew the Curleys weren't living in based on my conversations with their lawyer. Inside was a letter from Jonas, handwritten on lined paper in that same neat block lettering I'd seen in the chamber and on the evidence documents. And what he'd written confirmed my growing suspicion that the family's story had layers and complexities that hadn't been revealed during their official testimony. The letter began with expressions of gratitude for my role in the investigation and for the way I'd handled the evidence they'd left, but it quickly shifted into something stranger and more disturbing, a confession of sorts about methods and experiences that Jonas acknowledged would sound crazy, but that he felt compelled to share with someone who'd been affected by them. According to the letter, the decision to use radio transmissions as a method of communication and guidance hadn't been Jonas's idea originally, but had emerged from experiences the family had during their first year on the run, when they'd been living in the chamber in the sandstone formations, and dealing with isolation and fear that had pushed them to the edge of psychological breakdown. Emma had started hearing voices during that period, whispering presences that she'd insisted were trying to help the family, and while Jonas and Sarah had initially dismissed this as either imagination or trauma response, they'd gradually come to recognize that Emma's voices often provided information or warnings that proved accurate even though there was no rational way the child could have known what she was reporting. The voices had told Emma about patrol patterns and safe routes and locations where evidence could be hidden, and over time, the family had learned to trust these whispers even as they struggled to understand or explain them. Jonas wrote that he'd eventually attempted to communicate with whatever was providing information to Emma, using radio equipment he'd acquired specifically for that purpose, and he'd discovered that certain frequencies and locations seemed to facilitate connection with something he described as the land's memory, or the voices beneath, entities or forces that existed in the landscape itself, and that had awareness of events and people moving across the reservation. The radio transmissions I'd received hadn't been solely the result of Jonas broadcasting from hidden locations, but had been collaborative communications, with Jonas providing the technical means and intention, while something else provided the reach and timing that had made the transmission so uncannily appropriate to specific moments in the investigation. He acknowledged this sounded insane, that he wouldn't have believed it himself if he hadn't experienced it directly. But he felt compelled to share the truth with me because I'd been affected by these forces and deserved to understand what had been involved in guiding me through the evidence trail. The letter continued with Jonas explaining that he'd debated whether to include this information in his official testimony, but had ultimately decided that prosecutors and federal agents wouldn't be receptive to claims about supernatural or paranormal assistance in evidence collection, and that including such claims might undermine the credibility of the case and allow defendants to argue that the entire investigation was based on delusion rather than solid detective work. So he'd provided the sanitized version, the story about sophisticated equipment and careful surveillance that fit within normal frameworks and wouldn't trigger skepticism or dismissal, while keeping the truth private for sharing only with people who'd experienced similar phenomena and might understand what he was describing. He wrote that Agent Silversmith was one such person, someone who'd encountered enough unexplained events during reservation cases that he'd stopped trying to fit everything into rational categories. And Jonas believed I might be another based on my willingness to follow evidence that led into increasingly strange territory. The letter ended with a warning that disturbed me more than any of the supernatural claims Jonas had made. A statement that the corruption network we'd exposed and prosecuted was only one layer of a much deeper problem, and that forces beyond normal human greed and exploitation were active on the reservation in ways that most people never perceived or confronted. Jonas wrote that during his years of hiding and evidence collection, he'd encountered patterns suggesting that some of the resource extraction schemes weren't being driven solely by corporate profit motives, but by something older and more primal, entities or intelligences that fed on disruption and destruction, and that influenced human actors to serve purposes those humans didn't fully understand. He acknowledged this sounded like conspiracy theory or paranoid delusion, but he'd documented too many coincidences and impossibilities to dismiss the pattern, and he believed that exposing the human corruption was only a first step in addressing problems that had roots extending far deeper than any court case could reach. I read the letter 3 times, each reading leaving me more unsettled and uncertain about how to process what Jonas was claiming. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as the product of trauma and 6 years of paranoid survival, the kind of magical thinking that people develop when they're isolated and frightened and looking for meaning in random events. But another part of me, the part that had experienced those radio transmissions and felt the weight of being chosen for this investigation, recognized truth in what Jonas described, even if I couldn't articulate why or how I knew it was true. The reservation had always felt different to me than other places I'd worked or visited, carrying a presence and awareness that went beyond normal landscape, and cases here frequently developed aspects that resisted easy explanation, or fit into patterns that seemed orchestrated by intelligence beyond human planning. I filed the letter in my personal records rather than in official case files, uncertain whether it represented evidence that should be preserved or personal correspondence that had no bearing on the prosecutions that were still moving forward. Patricia asked me about it after seeing the package arrive, curious about what the Curleys had sent and whether it contained additional information relevant to ongoing investigations. But I told her it was just personal thanks and updates about the family's adjustment to witness protection, which was technically true, even if it omitted the stranger elements Jonas had described. I wasn't sure why I felt compelled to keep the letter's contents private, whether it was respect for Jonas's trust in sharing something he'd kept hidden from official channels, or my own uncertainty about how to discuss experiences that challenged frameworks I'd relied on throughout my career. The prosecutions continued for another 2 years, with most defendants accepting plea agreements that resulted in substantial prison sentences and financial penalties that would bankrupt some of the individuals and corporations involved. Randall Sozi received a 15-year federal sentence for conspiracy and bribery, and he would likely die in prison given his age and health conditions, a fate that seemed simultaneously appropriate and insufficient given the scope of harm his corruption had enabled. The environmental damage to reservation lands would take decades to remediate, and some of it would be permanent, aquifers contaminated beyond recovery, and sacred sites destroyed by mining operations that should never have been approved. The financial costs were staggering, but the cultural and spiritual costs were incalculable, measured in lost traditions and displaced families and relationships with land that had been severed or damaged beyond repair. Emma Curley turned 12 during the trials, and according to updates from Jennifer Begay, she'd become an advocate for other children who'd experienced trauma, speaking at events and writing about her experiences in ways that helped her process what she'd endured while giving voice to others who felt voiceless. She'd also developed an interest in environmental protection and tribal sovereignty issues, legacy of her father's investigation and her family's sacrifice, and there was talk that she might eventually pursue legal or environmental careers that would allow her to continue the work her parents had started. The resilience she demonstrated was remarkable, but I wondered how much of it was genuine recovery and how much was performance developed during 6 years of learning to hide her true feelings and present whatever face was necessary for survival. I visited the chamber and the sandstone formations periodically during the years following the investigation, drawn back to that space where the Curley family had lived, and documented their evidence, despite never being able to articulate exactly why I felt compelled to return. The writing on the walls remained visible for a while, protected from weather by the chamber's depth and orientation. But gradually it faded as exposure to moisture and temperature fluctuations eroded the softer sandstone surface. I photographed the walls each time I visited, preserving documentation of messages that had served as both chronicle and cry for help, and those photographs became part of my own archive of the case, filed alongside official reports and personal notes that tried to make sense of everything I'd experienced and learned. During one of these visits, about 3 years after the initial investigation, I experienced another radio transmission, unexpected and unexplained because my radio wasn't even turned on at the time, but somehow transmitted sound anyway. A burst of static followed by Emma's voice, older now but still recognizable, speaking words that made my breath catch. "Officer Begay, thank you for remembering us. Daddy says the work isn't finished, that there are still things buried that need to be found. He says you'll know when it's time to look again. The voices are quieter now, but they're still there, still trying to help. Don't forget to listen." The transmission ended, and when I examined my radio, it was definitely powered off, battery removed, incapable of receiving or transmitting anything through normal means. I stood in that chamber for a long time afterward, thinking about Jonas's letter and his claims about forces active beneath the surface of normal reality, about Emma's voices and the landscape's memory, about investigations that revealed layers of truth extending beyond what could be documented in evidence logs or testified to in courtrooms. The prosecution of the corruption network had been successful by any conventional measure, resulting in convictions and sentences that would deter future exploitation and provide some measure of justice to communities that had been victimized for decades. But Jonas's warning about deeper problems and older forces suggested that what we'd accomplished was incomplete, addressing symptoms rather than causes, and that the real work of protection and restoration might require methods and understanding that transcended conventional law enforcement. I continue working as a tribal police officer, handling cases that range from routine traffic violations to complex criminal investigations, and nothing I've encountered since the Curley case has quite matched its scope or strangeness. But I pay more attention now to details that don't fit normal patterns, to radio anomalies and impossible coincidences and information that arrives through channels that shouldn't exist, and I've learned to trust instincts that previously I would have dismissed as superstition or magical thinking. The reservation feels different to me now, more alive and more aware, as if the investigation opened perception to layers of reality that were always present, but that I'd been trained to ignore or explain away. And I find myself wondering whether other officers experience similar shifts in understanding, or whether I've simply been changed by proximity to something I'll never fully comprehend. Patricia, transferred to a federal task force focused on tribal environmental crimes, using skills and knowledge developed during the Curley investigation to pursue cases involving resource exploitation and regulatory violations across multiple reservations. We stay in contact, occasionally sharing information about cases or developments, and sometimes during our conversations she'll mention experiencing unusual phenomena, radio transmissions that shouldn't be possible, or witnesses who know things they shouldn't be able to know, and we'll exchange knowing looks that acknowledge shared experience without requiring explicit discussion of what we've encountered or what it might mean. Agent Silversmith retired from the FBI and moved back to the reservation permanently, taking a position as a consultant for tribal environmental protection agencies and using his federal experience to help communities resist exploitation and assert sovereignty. I see him occasionally at conferences or interagency meetings, and he always asks about the Curley family and whether I've heard from them recently, and I get the sense he's experienced additional phenomena that he's not comfortable discussing in professional contexts. We maintain the pretense that the case was straightforward prosecution of human corruption, but there's an understanding between us that goes beyond words, recognition that we've both been changed by exposure to something that resists easy categorization. The landscape holds secrets, and some of them surface when the time is right and the right people are positioned to understand what's being revealed. The Curley family's sacrifice exposed one layer of those secrets: corruption and exploitation that had operated for decades in shadows, and the prosecution that followed brought some measure of justice and accountability. But Jonas's letter and Emma's voice on that powered-off radio suggest there are deeper layers still buried, waiting for someone to have the courage and clarity to follow evidence trails that lead into territory where conventional frameworks no longer apply, and where truth takes forms that can't be captured in official reports or courtroom testimony. I keep the photographs from the chamber, and I keep Jonas's letter, and I keep my radio tuned to frequencies that sometimes carry whispers from sources I can't identify but have learned to trust. The work continues. Investigations into corruption and crime that follow normal procedures and generate normal documentation. But beneath that official work, I maintain awareness of patterns and possibilities that exist in margins and shadows, listening for voices that speak from depths the surface world pretends don't exist. Emma Curley heard those voices when she was 4 years old and living in darkness, and they guided her family through 6 years of survival and evidence collection. And they continue to whisper warnings and guidance to those willing to listen and act on information that arrives through impossible channels. The desert keeps its secrets until someone is ready to receive them, and even then the revelation is never complete, always holding back layers and complexities that require years or lifetimes to fully understand. I thought I was investigating an abandoned vehicle and a cold case disappearance, but what I discovered was evidence of systematic corruption and human courage and forces that operate beneath the surface of what we call reality, shaping events and influencing outcomes through means that resist scientific explanation or rational categorization. The Curley family trusted me with their evidence and their story, and I've done my best to honor that trust by pursuing justice through available channels while remaining open to possibilities that extend beyond those channels. But late at night, when I'm alone in the desert on patrol, when the radio occasionally crackles with static and whispers that shouldn't be there, I wonder about the voices Emma heard and the forces Jonas tried to describe in his letter. I wonder about what lies beneath the corruption we prosecuted, about older intelligences and deeper purposes that use human actors for ends those actors don't comprehend. And I wonder whether the work of protection and justice can ever be complete when the threats we face extend into dimensions we barely acknowledge and don't understand. The questions haunt me, and they'll likely haunt me for whatever remains of my career and life, because once you've heard those whispers and followed evidence trails that lead beyond normal boundaries, you can never quite return to comfortable certainties about what's real and what's possible. The Curley family is safe now, living under new identities in locations I'm not permitted to know, and Emma is growing into a young woman who'll carry scars and strength in equal measure from her childhood spent in hiding. Jonas's health continues to decline, the cost of 6 years without proper medical care compounding with age and stress. But he remains focused on education and advocacy, trying to help other communities avoid the exploitation his family suffered and exposed. Sarah teaches and heals, processing trauma through connection with students and the routine of normal life that was denied her for so long. They're survivors, all 3 of them, and the testimony they provided has already prevented similar corruption in other jurisdictions where officials saw what happened here and decided the risks weren't worth the rewards. But I can't shake the feeling that their story isn't finished, that the radio transmission I received in the chamber 3 years later was a promise or a warning about future revelations still waiting to surface. "The work isn't finished," Emma's voice had said. "There are still things buried that need to be found." I don't know what those things might be or when they'll demand attention, but I know I'll be watching and listening, maintaining awareness of patterns and anomalies that might signal the next investigation, the next trail of evidence left by people or forces trying to expose truth that powerful interests want kept hidden. The reservation stretches out beneath vast skies, beautiful and harsh, and holding histories that extend back thousands of years before European contact brought systems of exploitation and corruption that continue to this day in evolved forms. The land remembers, and sometimes it speaks, and those willing to listen might hear warnings or guidance that arrives through channels official training says don't exist, but that experience proves are real and powerful. I'm still learning to understand those channels and to trust information that arrives through them. But the Curley case taught me that some investigations require openness to possibilities beyond normal frameworks, and that truth often has layers that reveal themselves slowly across years or lifetimes rather than in neat packages suitable for courtroom presentation. My radio sits on my desk as I write this report, powered on and tuned to standard frequencies. But I know from experience that the most important transmissions often come through when the radio is off or on wrong frequencies, or in ways that technical manuals say are impossible. I keep it close anyway, a tool and a reminder that communication happens through multiple channels simultaneously, some official and documented, and others operating beneath the surface where forces older than human institutions maintain awareness and occasionally intervene when the balance tips too far toward exploitation and harm. The case is closed in official records, prosecutions complete, and sentences served, and evidence filed away in archives where it might be retrieved decades hence by researchers studying reservation history and corruption patterns. But the real case, the deeper investigation into forces and purposes that use human corruption as tools for ends we don't comprehend. That case remains open and active, waiting for the next revelation, the next abandoned vehicle or mysterious transmission that signals truth demanding exposure and justice demanding action. I'll be ready when that moment comes, whenever and however it arrives, because the Curley family's trust and Emma's voices and Jonas's letter have taught me that some responsibilities transcend official duty and require commitment to truth regardless of where that truth leads or what frameworks it challenges. The desert keeps its secrets, yes, but it also reveals them to those patient and brave enough to follow evidence trails into darkness, trusting that light exists even in places where official illumination fails to penetrate. And sometimes, late at night when the reservation is silent and the stars are bright enough to cast shadows, my radio whispers words I can't quite make out, but that I know are important. Voices from depths and distances trying to guide or warn or simply acknowledge that the work continues, and that others are listening too, maintaining vigil across the landscape where corruption and courage and forces beyond naming engage in struggles that shape reality in ways official history will never record, but that determine everything nonetheless. The call came through dispatch at 2:43 p.m. on a gray November afternoon, when the clouds hung low enough over Crown Point that you could almost reach up and touch them. The kind of weather that made the high desert feel claustrophobic despite the vast horizons visible on clearer days. I'd been with the Navajo Tribal Police for 11 years at that point, long enough to develop instincts about which calls would turn out routine and which ones carried weight that wouldn't become apparent until you were already deep into situations you couldn't easily back out of. This one started as a wellness check, the kind of request we received regularly when family members or neighbors became concerned about elderly residents who lived alone or in isolated areas where days could pass without anyone noticing if something went wrong. The dispatcher, a woman named Rita Todachin, who'd worked the afternoon shift for as long as I'd been on the force, told me a social worker from Indian Health Services had requested we check on an elderly couple named Thomas and Loretta Cheverillo, who lived about 8 miles east of town on a dirt road that branched off the main highway and wandered into terrain that got progressively rougher the farther you traveled from any kind of maintained infrastructure. The social worker, whose name was Darlene Manuelito, had explained that she'd been trying to conduct a scheduled home visit for the past 3 days, but each time she'd driven out to the Cheverillo property, she'd found the house locked up tight with no response to her knocking despite clear signs that someone was home, including vehicles in the driveway and smoke rising from the chimney. This wasn't entirely unusual for elderly residents who sometimes became confused or suspicious about strangers at their door. But what had prompted Darlene to request police intervention was a conversation she'd had with Thomas Cheverillo's nephew 2 days earlier, during which the nephew mentioned he'd also been unable to make contact with his aunt and uncle, despite trying both phone calls and personal visits over the past week. The nephew, who lived in Albuquerque and couldn't travel to Crown Point more than once every few weeks, had expressed concern that his uncle's health had been declining, and that his aunt might be struggling to care for him alone, which was the kind of situation that could deteriorate rapidly if left unaddressed. I took my partner Miles Kisto with me for the wellness check, both because protocol suggested having 2 officers present for elder welfare situations, and because Miles had grown up in the Crown Point area and knew many of the longtime residents by reputation, if not personally. Miles was in his late 20s, about 15 years younger than I was, but he had good instincts and a calm demeanor that worked well for dealing with situations that required patience rather than force. We drove out to the Cheverillo property in my patrol vehicle, following directions Rita had provided based on the address in the system, and as we turned off the main highway onto the dirt road, I noticed immediately what Darlene had mentioned about the terrain becoming rougher the farther we went. The road was barely maintained, more of a track worn into the earth by decades of vehicle passage than any kind of engineered surface, and it wound through landscape dominated by scrubland and arroyos that would become impassable during heavy rain, but they were currently just dry channels cutting across terrain that seemed designed to hide rather than reveal human habitation. The Cheverillo house came into view after about 20 minutes of driving, a traditional adobe structure that looked like it had been built sometime in the 1960s or 70s based on the style and materials, surrounded by a chain-link fence that enclosed maybe half an acre of yard space where a few scraggly trees struggled to maintain foliage despite the high desert conditions. 2 vehicles were parked in the driveway, an old Ford pickup truck that looked like it dated from the 1980s and a slightly newer sedan that might have been from the early 2000s. Both covered in a layer of dust that suggested they hadn't been driven recently. Smoke was indeed rising from the chimney, thin and steady, indicating someone had maintained a fire within the past few hours, and as Miles and I approached the property on foot after parking near the gate, I could see curtains moving slightly in one window as if someone inside had noticed our arrival and was watching to see what we would do. I called out as we approached the front door. identifying myself and Miles as tribal police officers conducting a wellness check at the request of Indian Health Services, keeping my voice friendly and non-threatening because the last thing we needed was to alarm elderly residents who might already be confused or frightened by the attention they'd been receiving. No response came from inside the house. Just that continued sense of being watched from behind curtains that didn't quite close all the way. Miles tried the door, finding it locked as Darlene had reported, and when he knocked loudly enough that anyone inside should have heard clearly, we waited a full minute without receiving any acknowledgement. I walked around the perimeter of the house, checking windows and looking for alternative entrances, and found that every window was not just closed, but appeared to be locked from the inside based on the position of the latches I could see through the glass, and the back door was similarly secured with what looked like multiple locks, including a deadbolt and a chain. What struck me as strange wasn't just that the house was locked. Elderly people living in isolated areas often took security seriously, but that the locks appeared to have been engaged from the inside, meaning someone was presumably home and choosing not to respond to our presence. I returned to the front door and knocked again, this time announcing more firmly that we were concerned for the residents' welfare and needed to verify that Thomas and Loretta Cheverillo were safe and not in need of medical assistance. Still no response, just that oppressive silence broken only by the wind moving through the sparse vegetation around the property. Miles suggested we might need to force entry if we couldn't establish contact, which was within our authority for wellness checks where there was reasonable concern that someone might be injured or incapacitated. But I hesitated because forcing our way into an elderly couple's home felt like an escalation that could create more problems than it solved if it turned out they were simply being stubborn about answering the door. I was debating our options when I noticed something that made the situation more complicated than a simple locked door mystery. The ground around the house, which had been muddy a few days earlier based on evidence of recent rain in the area, showed footprints leading away from the back door and circling the perimeter of the property before disappearing into the harder-packed earth near the fence line. The prints were fresh enough that they hadn't been completely worn away by wind and weather, probably made within the past day or two based on their definition, and what made them significant was their pattern and number. There were at least 3 different sets of prints based on the varying sizes and tread patterns I could identify, suggesting multiple people had been walking around the outside of the house recently, and the way the prints circled and overlapped suggested they'd been conducting some kind of surveillance or perimeter check rather than just arriving and leaving through normal approaches. Miles saw what I was looking at and came over to examine the prints more closely, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to something more concerned as he processed the same information I was. "That's not normal," he said quietly, voicing what we were both thinking. If the Cheverillos had been locked inside their house and not responding to visitors, why would there be fresh footprints all around the property from multiple people? The obvious answer was that someone other than the Cheverillos had been here recently, moving around the house in a pattern that suggested they were looking for something or monitoring the property, and that raised questions about whether this was still a simple wellness check or had become something more complicated involving potential threats to the elderly couple inside. I radioed back to dispatch to request backup and to run a check on any recent calls or reports involving the Cheverillo property, while Miles continued examining the footprints to see if he could determine anything else about their origin or purpose. Rita came back after a few minutes with information that added another layer of strangeness to the situation. According to her records, there had been no calls or reports involving the Cheverillo address in the past 6 months, which wasn't particularly unusual for a remote property. But when she'd contacted the nephew in Albuquerque to let him know we were conducting the wellness check, he'd mentioned something he hadn't told the social worker earlier. Apparently, Thomas Cheverillo had called his nephew about 2 weeks ago, speaking in what the nephew described as a confused and agitated manner, claiming that people were watching the house at night and that he'd seen figures moving in his yard when he looked out windows after dark. The nephew had assumed this was either paranoia related to his uncle's declining health or possibly early signs of dementia, and he'd planned to visit the following weekend to assess the situation. But work obligations had prevented him from making the trip until several days later, by which point he'd found the house locked and unresponsive just as we had. The nephew had checked with neighbors, the few who existed in this sparsely populated area, but no one had noticed anything unusual at the Cheverio property, and the general consensus had been that Thomas was probably just getting forgetful, and that Loretta was taking care of things as best she could. But the presence of these footprints suggested that Thomas's claims about being watched might not have been paranoid delusion, but accurate observation of genuine surveillance, and that transformed this wellness check into a potential home invasion or stalking situation that required a different tactical approach. Backup arrived in the form of Officer Patricia Littlecrow, who I'd worked with on previous cases and whose experience with elder welfare situations made her a valuable addition to our response. I briefed her on what we'd found, the locked doors and fresh footprints, and the nephew's report of Thomas claiming to be watched, and together the three of us decided we had sufficient cause to force entry to verify the occupant's safety. Miles retrieved the entry tools from his vehicle while Patricia and I positioned ourselves at the front door, weapons holstered but accessible, calling out one more time that we were entering the premises to conduct a welfare check and that the occupants should make themselves known if they were able. The door was solid and well maintained despite the house's age, and it took Miles several minutes of work with the pry bar before the locks finally gave way and the door swung inward, revealing an interior that was dim despite it being mid-afternoon because all the curtains had been drawn and very little natural light penetrated the rooms. The smell hit us immediately, not the overwhelming stench of death that would have indicated bodies had been present for days, but something subtler and more disturbing. A combination of wood smoke and what might have been sage or other herbs burning, along with an underlying mustiness that suggested the house hadn't been properly aired out in quite some time. I entered first, flashlight supplementing the dim interior lighting, calling out again for the Cheverios to identify themselves and confirm they were safe. The living room showed signs of recent occupation, a fire burning low in the fireplace, and what looked like a meal's worth of dishes sitting on a coffee table, but no people were immediately visible. We moved through the ground floor systematically, checking each room and finding them empty but clearly being used, beds unmade, and clothing laid out and bathrooms showing evidence of recent use. It was as if the occupants had simply vanished moments before our arrival, except that we'd been watching the house continuously and hadn't seen anyone leave, and the locked doors from the inside meant that, unless there was some hidden exit we hadn't discovered, the Cheverios should still be somewhere in the structure. Patricia found the basement door in the kitchen, a heavy wooden panel that opened onto steep stairs descending into darkness that our flashlights couldn't fully penetrate. The smell was stronger here, that sage smoke scent mixed with earth and something else I couldn't quite identify, and as we descended carefully, weapons now drawn because the situation had shifted from welfare check to potential crisis, I felt a profound unease that had nothing to do with the tactical challenges of searching an unfamiliar basement, and everything to do with the atmosphere of wrongness that seemed to permeate the entire structure. The basement was unfinished, just bare earth floor and stone foundation walls, and in the beam of my flashlight I could see evidence of recent activity, disturbed earth in several locations, and what looked like offerings or ritual items arranged on makeshift shelves carved into the walls. At the far end of the basement, barely visible in the shadows, we found them. Thomas and Loretta Cheverio were sitting on the floor with their backs against the wall, both appearing conscious and watching us with expressions that mixed fear and relief in equal measure. Thomas looked to be in his late 70s or early 80s, thin and weathered with gray hair pulled back in a traditional manner, while Loretta appeared slightly younger and healthier, though still showing the signs of age and stress that came from living in harsh conditions with limited resources. Neither spoke when we called out to them, and as we approached carefully, I noticed that Thomas was holding what looked like a ceremonial item, possibly a medicine bundle based on the way it was wrapped and decorated, and that both he and his wife seemed to be positioned as if they'd been conducting some kind of ritual or seeking protection rather than hiding from intruders. "Mr. Cheverillo, Mrs. Cheverillo," I said gently, keeping my weapon pointed down now that it was clear they weren't a threat and we weren't dealing with an active home invasion. "We're tribal police, here to check on your welfare. Your nephew and the social worker were concerned because they couldn't reach you. Are you both okay? Do either of you need medical attention?" Thomas looked at his wife, and some silent communication passed between them before he finally spoke, his voice hoarse and uncertain. "We couldn't let them in, the ones who watch. We had to stay inside, keep the doors locked. They come at night, officer. They walk around the house looking in windows, trying the doors. We hear them whispering, but we can't understand the words. It's been going on for weeks now." His words confirmed the nephew's report, but raised more questions than they answered, because if someone had been genuinely harassing this elderly couple to the point where they'd lock themselves in their basement and refuse to answer their door, even to concerned family members and authorities, we were dealing with a serious stalking or intimidation situation that required immediate investigation and intervention. But something about the way Thomas spoke, the certainty in his voice when he mentioned the ones who watch, suggested he believed the threat was something beyond normal human perpetrators, and that complicated our response because we couldn't investigate supernatural beliefs, but we also couldn't dismiss genuine fear that was affecting these people's ability to live safely in their own home. Patricia knelt down next to Loretta, speaking quietly to assess her physical and mental state, while Miles and I helped Thomas to his feet and guided him toward the stairs. Both seemed weak from what was probably inadequate food and water intake over the past several days, and there were signs of dehydration and possibly hypothermia from spending extended periods in an unheated basement. We got them upstairs to the warmer living room and called for an ambulance to transport them to the IHS clinic for evaluation, while I began the process of documenting the scene and trying to understand what had actually been happening at this property over the past weeks. The footprints outside were real, that much was certain, and they indicated that people had been circling the house recently enough that the prints hadn't been erased by weather. But whether those people were the ones who watch that Thomas feared, or whether they were concerned neighbors or family members trying to check on the couple, or whether they were something else entirely, I couldn't determine from the evidence available at the scene. What I could determine was that Thomas and Loretta Cheverillo had been genuinely terrified, had spent days locked in their basement conducting what appeared to be protective rituals, and had only emerged when forced entry by police made remaining hidden no longer viable. As we waited for the ambulance, I examined the ritual items Thomas had been holding, photographing them but not disturbing them because I wasn't sure what cultural significance they might have and didn't want to violate any protocols I wasn't aware of. The items included what looked like sage and cedar bundled together, stones with markings I didn't recognize, but that might have been traditional symbols, and a small pouch containing substances I couldn't identify without chemical analysis. Thomas watched me document these items with an expression that suggested both protectiveness and resignation. And when I asked him about their purpose, he said quietly, "Protection. Against the ones who shouldn't be walking. They're not from here, officer. Not from the world we see in daylight. They come from beneath, from places where things got buried that should have stayed buried." His words sent a chill through me that I tried to suppress because I needed to maintain professional objectivity and not get drawn into interpretations based on traditional beliefs that I didn't fully understand and couldn't investigate using normal law enforcement methods. But the conviction in his voice, the genuine terror that had driven this couple to lock themselves away and refuse help even from family members they trusted, suggested we were dealing with something more complex than simple paranoia or mental health crisis. Whether the threat was supernatural or human, or some combination of both, these people had experienced something that had fundamentally altered their sense of safety in their own home, and addressing that would require resources and understanding that went beyond basic wellness checks and evidence collection. The ambulance arrived, and the paramedics began assessing the Cheverrillos' condition, determining they needed hospitalization for dehydration and exposure, but that their lives weren't in immediate danger. As they were being loaded into the ambulance, Thomas grabbed my arm with surprising strength for someone in his weakened condition and pulled me close enough to whisper, "Don't stay here after dark, officer. The ones who watch, they don't show themselves in daylight. But when the sun goes down, you'll see. You'll understand why we couldn't open the door. Check the mud near the back fence. Look at the prints carefully. You'll see they don't belong to anything that should be walking on two legs." Thomas Cheverrillo's warning echoed in my mind as the ambulance pulled away, carrying the elderly couple toward the medical care they desperately needed after days of self-imposed isolation in their basement. Miles and Patricia were preparing to secure the house and return to the station, assuming our work here was complete now that the wellness check had been resolved and the Cheverrillos were safe. But I couldn't shake the old man's final words about the footprints near the back fence, and his insistence that they didn't belong to anything that should be walking on two legs. Professional training told me to dismiss this as the product of fear and possible cognitive decline, but 11 years of working on the reservation had taught me that dismissing things I didn't understand was often a mistake that led to incomplete investigations and unresolved situations that would resurface later with worse consequences. I told Miles and Patricia I wanted to examine the property more thoroughly before we left, documenting the footprints and checking the perimeter for any evidence that might explain who'd been circling the house and terrorizing the Cheverrillos to the point of hiding in their basement. Patricia needed to return to the station for another call, but Miles agreed to stay and help me process the scene, though I could see in his expression that he thought I was overthinking what was probably just a case of elderly people becoming paranoid about normal sounds and shadows that isolation and declining health had transformed into perceived threats. We spent the next hour photographing and measuring the footprints we'd initially noticed, documenting their patterns and trying to establish how many different individuals had been present and when they'd been here based on the condition of the impressions in the dried mud. What we found was both more and less than I'd expected. More in terms of the sheer number of prints, suggesting this hadn't been a single incident, but multiple visits over an extended period, and less in terms of clarity because many of the prints were partial or degraded enough that getting detailed information about shoe size or tread pattern was difficult. But there were enough complete impressions to establish that at least 3 and possibly 4 different individuals had been walking around the Cheverrillo property, and the pattern of their movement suggested surveillance rather than casual approach, circling the house multiple times and pausing at windows and doors, as if checking for vulnerabilities or trying to see inside. Miles pointed out that the prints led both to and from the back fence, suggesting whoever made them had been entering and leaving the property from that direction, rather than using the main driveway, which supported the idea that this was deliberate intrusion rather than legitimate visitors. When we reached the back fence line where Thomas had specifically directed me to look, I understood immediately why the old man's warning had been so urgent and why his description of the prints had been so unsettling. The impressions here were deeper and more complete than those closer to the house, preserved in a patch of mud that had remained softer longer because it was shaded by a cluster of juniper trees, and what they showed didn't match any footwear pattern I'd seen in 11 years of examining crime scenes and accident sites. The prints were roughly the size and shape of human feet, maybe size 10 or 11 men's boots based on the length and width, but the arrangement of the impression suggested something was fundamentally wrong with either the footwear or the feet making them. Normal shoes and boots have recognizable patterns, heels and toes and treads designed for traction and wear, but these prints showed only smooth indentations with what looked like irregular protrusions at points where toes or boot rivets might be expected, creating patterns that seemed almost random rather than following any design logic. More disturbing was that some of the prints showed what appeared to be a dragging or scraping mark between steps, as if whoever or whatever was making them wasn't lifting their feet completely with each stride, but was partially shuffling or sliding across the ground in a manner that would be exhausting and inefficient for normal bipedal movement. I'd seen similar patterns before in cases involving injured people or individuals with mobility impairments, but those typically showed one foot dragging while the other stepped normally, whereas these prints suggested both feet were moving in this strange sliding shuffle. Miles saw what I was looking at, and his skepticism about the situation shifted to something more like unease as he processed the same information I was struggling to categorize. "That's not normal," he said quietly, echoing his earlier assessment, but with more conviction now that we had clear evidence of genuinely anomalous activity. Whatever made these prints, they weren't wearing regular shoes, and they weren't walking like people normally walk. I took extensive photographs and made plaster casts of the best preserved prints, knowing that without physical evidence to support what we were seeing, any report I filed would be dismissed as either incompetence or imagination, and I needed documentation that would hold up to skeptical review from supervisors who hadn't been present to witness the strangeness firsthand. As we worked, the afternoon light began to fade, the gray clouds that had hung low all day growing darker and more oppressive as evening approached. Miles checked his watch and suggested we finish up and head back to town before full darkness fell, not because he believed Thomas's warning about things that appeared after sunset, or at least not consciously, but because processing crime scenes in darkness was always more difficult and prone to errors that could compromise evidence. I agreed in principle, but I also felt a growing compulsion to remain at the property through the evening, to see whether the Cheverio's fears had any basis in observable phenomena, or whether their terror had been the product of imagination amplified by isolation and declining health. I told Miles he could head back and I'd stay for a few more hours to complete the documentation and secure the property, expecting him to accept the offer gratefully and leave me to work alone. But instead he surprised me by saying he'd stay as well because he didn't think I should be out here by myself, given the evidence we'd found of multiple intruders who'd been conducting surveillance on an elderly couple's home. His concern was practical rather than supernatural, focused on the possibility that whoever had been terrorizing the Cheverios might return and pose a threat to a lone officer. But I appreciated his willingness to remain regardless of his reasoning. We radioed our position to dispatch, letting Rita know we'd be at the Cheverio property for several more hours, completing the investigation, and she logged our location and status with the routine efficiency of someone who'd handled thousands of similar updates over her years working the desk. We set up in the Cheverio living room with lights on and coffee brewing in their kitchen, maintaining professional protocols about not disturbing the scene more than necessary, but also making ourselves comfortable for what might be a long wait if anything was actually going to happen after dark. The house felt different with just the two of us present, emptier and somehow more oppressive than it had when we'd been focused on finding the missing occupants, and I found myself noticing details I'd overlooked during our initial search. The windows all had heavy curtains, which wasn't unusual for desert homes trying to manage heat and light, but these curtains had been reinforced with what looked like blankets and towels hung behind them, creating multiple layers that would block any view into the house from outside, while also preventing occupants from seeing out. The front door, which we'd forced open during our entry, had been secured with not just the standard deadbolt, but with multiple additional locks that Thomas and Loretta had apparently installed themselves. commercial-grade hardware that seemed excessive for a rural property where crime rates were generally low and neighbors were too sparse and distant to pose much threat. The basement door we'd found the couple hiding behind had similar over-securing, with a heavy bolt that could be locked from the basement side, suggesting they'd created a fallback position where they could retreat if the upstairs locks failed to keep intruders out. All of this pointed to genuine sustained fear, rather than sudden paranoid episode, a defensive posture built up over time in response to perceived threats that had been serious enough to justify significant effort and expense to fortify against. As darkness fell completely, around 6 p.m., given the season and our location, I noticed the temperature inside the house dropping despite the fire we'd built up in the fireplace. Not dramatically, but enough that both Miles and I pulled our jackets tighter and moved closer to the heat source. The wind outside had picked up, creating sounds that could easily be mistaken for footsteps or voices if you were inclined toward that interpretation, and I found myself listening more intently than usual to the normal creaks and settling noises that old houses make. Miles was monitoring the windows, using his flashlight to periodically check the yard and perimeter, and about an hour after full darkness had fallen, he called me over to look at something he'd noticed near the back fence line. At first, I couldn't see what had caught his attention, just darkness and the vague shapes of trees and fence posts barely visible in the ambient light from our flashlights. But then movement caught my eye, subtle and low to the ground, like shadows sliding across the earth in patterns that didn't match the wind-driven movement of vegetation. I grabbed the thermal imaging scope from my equipment bag, a tool we used occasionally for search and rescue operations or tracking suspects at night, and when I aimed it toward where the movement had been, the screen showed heat signatures that made my breath catch. There were figures out there, at least 3 and possibly more based on the thermal patterns, moving along the fence line in that same sliding, shuffling gait that the footprints had suggested, and their heat signatures were wrong, colder than human body temperature should register, but warmer than ambient ground temperature, creating a visual pattern on the scope that looked like smeared or unfocused images, rather than the clear, human-shaped outlines I was accustomed to seeing. Miles looked through the scope after I offered it to him, and I watched his expression shift from curiosity to alarm as he processed what he was seeing, the confirmation that something was indeed out there, and that it wasn't moving or presenting the way people normally did. "What are they?" he asked quietly, though I had no answer that would make sense based on my training or experience. We watched through the scope as the figures continued their perimeter circuit, occasionally pausing at windows or doors, just as the footprint patterns had suggested, and during those pauses I could almost convince myself I heard sounds. Not quite voices, but something that might have been attempts at communication. Whispers and scraping noises that could have been wind and branches, but that carried an intentional quality I couldn't rationally justify but couldn't dismiss. I made the decision to go outside and attempt contact, knowing this was probably foolish, but also knowing that sitting inside and watching through scopes wasn't going to provide the answers we needed about what was happening on this property, and why the Cheverios had been so terrified they'd lock themselves in their basement rather than face whatever was out there. Miles tried to argue against it, suggesting we call for backup or wait until morning when visibility would be better, but I overruled him and we prepared to exit through the back door, weapons drawn and flashlights ready, treating this as we would any investigation of trespassers or potential threats on private property. The cold hit us immediately when we opened the door. Not the normal desert night chill, but something more penetrating and unnatural, as if we'd stepped into a freezer rather than just outside. Our breath fogged in the flashlight beams, and frost was forming on the ground despite temperatures that shouldn't support freezing conditions based on the weather forecast and seasonal norms for the area. The figures we'd seen through the thermal scope were no longer visible to normal sight, but I could feel their presence, that sense of being watched and evaluated that predators give off when they're deciding whether something is prey or threat. I called out, identifying myself as tribal police and demanding that anyone on the property reveal themselves immediately, and the response was silence followed by movement at the edge of our flashlight range, shadows pulling back and retreating but not disappearing completely. Miles moved to check the fence line while I covered him, and he called back after a moment that there were fresh prints in the frost. The same strange shuffle drag pattern we'd documented earlier, but now being made in real time by whatever was circling the property. As I moved to join him, something grabbed my ankle, not hard enough to pull me down, but with enough force to make me stumble and swing my flashlight down to see what had caught me. There was nothing visible in the beam, no hand or rope or natural obstruction, but I could feel pressure on my leg like fingers gripping through my pants, cold enough that it hurt even through the fabric. And when I jerked away, the pressure released, and I heard something that might have been laughter or might have been wind, but that sent primal fear racing through my nervous system regardless of what rational explanations might exist. Miles had his weapon raised and was scanning for targets, but there was nothing to aim at, just shadows and cold, and that continuing sense of presence without visible form. And we made the tactical decision to retreat back into the house because engaging with threats you couldn't see or properly identify was a good way to create friendly fire situations or waste ammunition on nothing. We backed toward the door, maintaining defensive positions and keeping our lights sweeping the area. And as we crossed the threshold back into the house, I saw them clearly for just a moment. Figures standing at the fence line watching us with postures that suggested human shape, but with proportions and movements that were fundamentally wrong. Too tall and too thin, and moving in that shuffling slide that no human joint structure should be able to sustain. The door slammed shut behind us, though neither of us had touched it, and the locks that we'd forced open during our initial entry suddenly engaged with loud clicks that echoed through the house like gunshots. Miles and I looked at each other, both understanding that we'd just experienced something that couldn't be explained through normal frameworks, but that we'd need to find some way to document and report if we were going to justify our continued presence at this property, or explain to supervisors why we'd been so thoroughly unnerved by what should have been a routine scene security assignment. I checked my body camera and found that it had recorded our exit from the house and the moments immediately following, but the footage showed only darkness and our flashlight beams sweeping across empty yard. No figures at the fence line, and no visible cause for my stumbling or the door slamming shut. We spent the rest of the night inside with every light in the house turned on, and the fire built up high enough that the living room became uncomfortably warm, preferable to the unnatural cold we'd experienced outside. The sounds continued throughout the night, scratching at windows and doors, and what might have been whispers in a language I didn't recognize. And several times Miles and I both heard footsteps on the roof, heavy enough to be clearly audible, but not heavy enough to match human weight based on the way the old structure creaked and settled under the sound. I documented everything in my notebook, knowing that official reports would require sanitized versions that focused on evidence of trespassing and harassment rather than supernatural phenomena, but wanting to preserve the full experience while it was still fresh in memory. Dawn came as a relief, the gray light filtering through the reinforced curtains and the sounds outside gradually fading until we could convince ourselves they'd been products of imagination, amplified by darkness and isolation. We exited the house cautiously, finding that the frost had melted and the fresh prints we'd seen being made during the night were gone, either erased by the thaw or never having been as substantial as we'd believed in the moment. The property in daylight looked entirely normal, just an aging house surrounded by high desert scrubland with nothing to suggest the terror we'd experienced during the dark hours, or the sustained harassment that had driven the Cheverrillos to lock themselves in their basement. The investigation continued for another 2 weeks, with multiple officers conducting surveillance of the property during different hours and under different conditions, but none of them reported experiencing anything unusual beyond normal desert wildlife and weather phenomena. The Cheverrios recovered physically from their ordeal, but refused to return to their home, moving in with family in Albuquerque, and eventually selling the property to a developer who planned to renovate and resell it. I filed reports that documented the footprints and the evidence of sustained trespassing, recommending increased patrols in the area and suggesting that the new owners be advised about past security concerns. But I left out the details about what Miles and I had experienced that night because including them would have compromised my credibility and served no practical purpose in terms of protecting future residents. But I kept my personal notes, including photographs of the strange prints and the thermal scope readings that showed heat signatures that didn't match any human or animal patterns I could identify, and I added them to a growing file of incidents from my years on the reservation that couldn't be explained through conventional frameworks. Miles transferred to a different district about 6 months later, citing personal reasons, but when I spoke with him before he left, he admitted that the night at the Cheverrio house had changed something fundamental in his understanding of what was possible and what our role as law enforcement was supposed to be when dealing with threats that existed outside the boundaries of criminal code and investigative procedure. Thomas Cheverrio died 8 months after we found him and Loretta hiding in their basement, his health never fully recovering from the stress and exposure of those days spent conducting protective rituals against whatever had been circling his home. At his funeral, which I attended out of respect and a sense of continued connection to the case, Loretta pulled me aside and thanked me for believing them, for not dismissing her husband's fears as dementia or paranoia, even though official reports had necessarily focused on human trespassers rather than the things that walk at night in forms that shouldn't exist. She told me that Thomas had been relieved when she told him Miles and I had stayed at the house after dark, because it meant someone else had witnessed what he'd been trying to explain to family members who thought he was losing his mind, and that validation had given him peace during his final months, even though it didn't change the outcome. I still drive past the Cheverrio property occasionally when I'm working in that area, and I notice that it remains empty despite being sold and supposedly scheduled for renovation, as if something about the land or the house makes people unwilling to stay once they've spent time there. The footprints near the back fence have long since been erased by weather and time, and the thermal scope recordings I made that night are too degraded and ambiguous to serve as proof of anything beyond the fact that cold spots and unusual heat signatures can occur for various natural reasons that don't require supernatural explanations. But I remember the feeling of being watched, the grip on my ankle from hands I couldn't see, the figures at the fence line that moved in ways human bodies shouldn't be able to move. And I understand why Thomas and Loretta chose to lock themselves in their basement rather than face whatever walks at night around certain properties on the reservation. The case is officially closed, categorized as elder harassment by unknown trespassers who were never identified or apprehended, and the Cheverrio house sits empty on its isolated road, waiting for someone brave or ignorant enough to try living there again. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm working patrol in remote areas, I think about what Thomas told me before the ambulance took him away. His warning about things that come from beneath, from places where things got buried that should have stayed buried. And I wonder what we're really dealing with out here in these vast empty spaces where the border between worlds might be thinner than we're comfortable acknowledging, and where what walks at night doesn't always follow rules we've established for distinguishing between possible and impossible. The footprints remain in my files, photographed and documented but never explained, evidence of something that circled an elderly couple's home and terrified them enough that they chose isolation and ritual protection over seeking help from authorities they assumed wouldn't believe them. They were right to be skeptical, because even having experienced it myself, I struggle to find words that capture what happened that night or frameworks that make sense of presences that exist without visible form and leave traces that disappear with daylight. The reservation has always had places and phenomena that resist easy categorization, and the Cheverrio property has joined the list of locations I mark mentally as requiring caution and respect for things I don't understand, but have learned not to dismiss. Thomas's final warning echoes in my memory whenever I encounter cases that seem to involve more than straightforward criminal activity or natural phenomena, reminding me that sometimes what walks on two legs isn't human, and what leaves footprints in mud doesn't always follow the rules we've established for distinguishing between real and imagined threats. The investigation taught me that official reports and documented evidence serve important purposes, but can't always capture the full truth of experiences that challenge our assumptions about what's possible in spaces where old beliefs and modern authority overlap in ways that satisfy neither traditional understanding nor scientific explanation. The house stands empty, and sometimes when I drive past at night, I think I see movement near the back fence line, shadows that slide rather than walk. And I don't stop to investigate because I've learned that some things are better observed from a distance than confronted directly. Whatever terrified the Cheverrios, whether it was human cruelty or something older and stranger, it remains present in that place, and the footprints that don't quite match any pattern I can identify serve as reminder that the work of protecting people sometimes requires acknowledging threats that exist outside the frameworks we're trained to use, and accepting that resolution isn't always possible for cases that involve forces we can't see or touch or arrest, but that leave traces enough to prove they're real to those willing to look carefully at what shouldn't be there.